Mother Earth. But can you be certain? Are you sure that even a professional historian can always distinguish between victory and defeat? Gustav Stein, who delivered himself of that mocking question with a whiskered smile and a gentle wipe at the grey moustache from the neighbourhood of which he had just removed an empty glass, was not an historian. He was a physiologist. But his companion was an historian, and he accepted the gentle thrust with a smile of his own. Stein's apartment was, for Earth, quite luxurious. It lacked the empty privacy of the outer worlds, of course, since from its window there stretched outward a phenomenon that belonged only to the home planet, a city. A large city, full of people, rubbing shoulders, mingling sweat. Nor was Stein's apartment fitted with its own power and its own utility supply. It lacked even the most elementary quota of positronic robots. In short, it lacked the dignity of self-sufficiency, and like all things on Earth, it was merely part of a community, a pendant unit of a cluster, a portion of a mob. But Stein was an Earthman by birth and used to it. And after all, by Earth standards the apartment was still luxurious. It was just that looking outward through the same windows before which lay the city, one could see the stars and among them the outer worlds, where there were no cities but only gardens. Where the lawns were streaks of emerald, where all human beings were kings, and where all good Earthmen earnestly and vainly hoped to go someday. Except for a few who knew better, like Gustav Stein. The Friday evenings with Edward Field belonged to that class of ritual which comes with age and quiet life. It broke the week pleasantly for two elderly bachelors, and gave them an innocuous reason to linger over the sherry and the stars. It took them away from the crudities of life, and, most of all, it let them talk. Field, especially, as a lecturer, scholar and man of modest means, quoted chapter and verse from a still incompleted history of terrestrian empire. "I wait for the last act," he explained. "Then I can call it The Decline and Fall of Empire and publish it. You must expect the last act to come soon, then. In a sense, it has come already. It is just that it is best to wait for all to recognize that fact. You see, there are 3 times when an empire or an economic system or a social institution falls, you skeptic." Field paused for effect and waited patiently for Stein to say, "And those times are?" First, Field ticked off a right forefinger. "There is the time when just a little nub shows up that points an inexorable way to finality. It can't be seen or recognized until the finality arrives, when the original nub becomes visible to hindsight. And you can tell what that little nub is?" "I think so, since I already have the advantage of a century and a half of hindsight. It came when the Syrian sector colony, Aurora, first obtained permission of the central government at Earth to introduce positronic robots into their community life. Obviously, looking back at it, the road was clear for the development of a thoroughly mechanized society based upon robot labor and not human labor. And it is this mechanization that has been and will yet be the deciding factor in the struggle between the outer worlds and Earth." "It is?" murmured the psychologist. "How infernally clever you historians are! What and where is the second time the empire fell?" "The second point in time," and Field gently bent his right middle finger backward, "arrives when a signpost is raised for the expert so large and plain that it can be seen even without the aid of perspective. And that point has been passed, too, with the first establishment of an immigration quota against Earth by the outer worlds. The fact that Earth found itself unable to prevent an action so obviously detrimental to itself was a shout for all to hear, and that was 50 years ago. Better and better. And the third point? The third point? Down went the ring finger. That is the least important. That is when the signpost becomes a wall with a huge "The End" scrawled upon it. The only requirement for knowing that the end has come, then, is neither perspective nor training, but merely the ability to listen to the video. I take it that the third point in time has not yet come. Obviously not, or you would not need to ask. Yet it may come soon. For instance, if there is war. Do you think there will be?" Field avoided commitment. Times are unsettled, and a good deal of feudal emotion is sweeping Earth on the immigration question. and if there should be a war, Earth would be defeated quickly and lastingly, and the wall would be erected. Can you be certain? Are you sure that even a professional historian can always distinguish between victory and defeat? Field smiled. He said, you may know something I do not. For instance, they talk about something called the Pacific Project. I never heard of it. Stein refilled the two glasses. Let us speak of other things. He held up his glass to the broad windows so that the far stars flickered rosily in the clear liquid and said, to a happy ending to Earth's troubles. Field held up his own, to the Pacific Project. Stein sipped gently and said, but we drink to two different things. Do we? It is quite difficult to describe any of the outer worlds to a native Earthman, since it is not so much a description of a world that is required as a description of a state of mind. The outer worlds, some 50 of them, originally colonies, later dominions, later nations, differ extremely among themselves in a physical sense. But the state of mind is somewhat the same throughout. It is something that grows out of a world not originally congenial to mankind, yet populated by the cream of the difficult, the different, the daring, the deviant. If it is to be expressed in a word, that word is individuality. There is the world of Aurora, for instance, 3 parsecs from Earth. It was the first planet settled outside the solar system, and represented the dawn of interstellar travel. Hence its name. It had air and water to start with, perhaps, but on earthly standards it was rocky and infertile. The plant life that did exist, sustained by a yellow-green pigment completely unrelated to chlorophyll and not as efficient, gave the comparatively fertile regions a decidedly bilious and unpleasant appearance to unaccustomed eyes. No animal life higher than unicellular, and the equivalent of bacteria as well, were present. Nothing dangerous, naturally, since the two biological systems, of Earth and Aurora, were chemically unrelated. Aurora became, quite gradually, a patchwork. Grains and fruit trees came first. Shrubs, flowers and grass afterward. Herds of livestock followed. And, as if it were necessary to prevent too close a copy of the mother planet, positronic robots also came to build the mansions, carve the landscapes, lay the power units. In short, to do the work, and turn the planet green and human. There was the luxury of a new world and unlimited mineral resources. There was the splendid excess of atomic power laid out on new foundations with merely thousands, or, at most, millions, not billions, to service. There was the vast flowering of physical science, in worlds where there was room for it. Take the home of Franklin Maynard, for instance, who, with his wife, 3 children, and 27 robots, lived on an estate more than 40 miles away, in distance, from the nearest neighbor. Yet by community wave he could, if he wished, share the living room of any of the 75 million on Aurora, with each singly. With all simultaneously. Maynard knew every inch of his valley. He knew just where it ended, sharply, and gave way to the alien crags, along whose undesirable slopes the angular, sharp leaves of the native firs clung sullenly, as if in hatred of the softer matter that had usurped its place in the sun. Maynard did not have to leave that valley. He was a deputy in the gathering, and a member of the Foreign Agents Committee, but he could transact all business but the most extremely essential, by community wave, without ever sacrificing that precious privacy he had to have in a way no Earthman could understand. Even the present business could be performed by community wave. The man, for instance, who sat with him in his living room, was Charles Huckman, and he, actually, was sitting in his own living room on an island in an artificial lake stocked with 50 varieties of fish, which happened to be 25 miles distant, in space. The connection was an illusion, of course. If Maynard were to reach out a hand, he could feel the invisible wall. Even the robots were quite accustomed to the paradox, and when Hickman raised a hand for a cigarette, Maynard's robot made no move to satisfy the desire, though a half-minute passed before Hickman's own robot could do so. The two men spoke like outer-worlders, that is, stiffly and in syllables too clipped to be friendly, and yet certainly not hostile. Merely undeniably lacking in the cream, however sour and thin at times, of human sociability which is so forced upon the inhabitants of Earth's ant heaps. Maynard said, "I have long wanted a private communion, Hickman, my duties in the gathering, this year. Quite. That is understood. You are welcome now, of course. In fact, especially so, since I have heard of the superior nature of your grounds and landscaping. Is it true that your cattle are fed on imported grass? I'm afraid that is a slight exaggeration. Actually, certain of my best milkers feed on terrestrial imports during calving time, but such a procedure would be prohibitively expensive, I'm afraid, if made general. It yields quite extraordinary milk, however. May I have the privilege of sending you a day's output? It would be most kind of you. Hoekman bent his head, gravely. You must receive some of my salmon in return. To a terrestrial eye, the two men might have appeared much alike. Both were tall, though not unusually so for Aurora, where the average height of the adult male is 6 feet 1½ inches. Both were blond and hard-muscled, with sharp and pronounced features. Though neither was younger than 40, middle age as yet sat lightly upon them. So much for amenities. Without a change in tone, Maynard proceeded to the serious purpose of his call. He said, the committee, you know, is now largely engaged with Morianu and his conservatives. We would like to deal with them firmly, we have the independence, that is. But before we can do so with the requisite calm and certainty, I would like to ask you certain questions. Why me? Because you are Aurora's most important physicist. Modesty is an unnatural attitude, and one which is only with difficulty taught to children. In an individualistic society it is useless, and Hickman was, therefore, unencumbered with it. He simply nodded objectively at Maynard's last words. And, continued Maynard, as one of us. You are an independent. I am a member of the party. Dues paying, but not very active. Nevertheless safe. Now, tell me, have you heard of the Pacific Project? The Pacific Project? There was a polite inquiry in his words. It is something which is taking place on Earth. The Pacific is a terrestrial ocean, but the name itself probably has no significance. I have never heard of it. I am not surprised. Few have, even on Earth. Our communion, by the way, is via tight beam and nothing must go further. I understand. Whatever Pacific Project is, and our agents are extremely vague, it might conceivably be a menace. Many of those who on Earth pass for scientists seem to be connected with it. Also, some of Earth's more radical and foolish politicians. Whom? There was once something called the Manhattan Project. Yes, urged Maynard, what about it? Oh, it's an ancient thing. It merely occurred to me because of the analogy in names. The Manhattan Project was before the time of extraterrestrial travel. Some petty war in the Dark Ages occurred, and it was the name given to a group of scientists who developed atomic power. Ah, Maynard's hand became a fist, and what do you think the Pacific Project can do, then? Hoekman considered. Then, softly, do you think Earth is planning war? On Maynard's face there was a sudden expression of distaste. 6 billion people. 6 billion half-apes, rather, jammed into one system to a near-explosion point, facing only some millions of us, total. Don't you think it is a dangerous situation? Oh, numbers. All right. Are we safe despite the numbers? Tell me. I'm only an administrator, and you're a physicist. Can Earth win a war in any way? Hoekman sat solemnly in his chair and thought carefully and slowly. Then he said, let us reason. There are 3 broad classes of methods whereby an individual or a group can gain his ends against opposition. On an increasing level of subtlety, those 3 classes can be termed the physical, the biological and the psychological. Now, the physical can be easily eliminated. Earth does not have an industrial background. It does not have a technical know-how. It has very limited resources. It lacks even a single outstanding physical scientist. So it is as impossible as anything in the galaxy can be that they can develop any form of physico-chemical application that is not already known to the outer worlds. Provided, of course, that the conditions of the problem imply single-handed opposition on the part of Earth against any or all of the outer worlds. I take it that none of the outer worlds intends leaguing with Earth against us. Maynard indicated violent opposition even to the suggestion. No, no, no. There is no question of that. Put it out of your mind. Then, ordinary physical surprise weapons are inconceivable. It is useless to discuss it further. Then, what about your second class, the biological? Slowly, Huckman lifted his eyebrows. Now, that is less certain. Some terrestrial biologists are quite competent, I am told. Naturally, since I am myself a physicist, I am not entirely qualified to judge this. Yet I believe that in certain restricted fields, they are still expert. In agricultural science, of course, to give an obvious example. And in bacteriology. Yes, what about bacteriological warfare? A thought. But no, quite inconceivable. A teeming, constricted world such as Earth cannot afford to fight an open lattice work of 50 sparse worlds with germs. They are infinitely more subject to epidemics, that is, to retaliation in kind. In fact, I would say that given our living conditions here on our and on the other outer worlds, no contagious disease could really take hold. No, Maynard. You can check with a bacteriologist, but I think he'll tell you the same. Maynard said, and the third class? The psychological? Now, that is unpredictable. And yet the outer worlds are intelligent and healthy communities not amenable to ordinary propaganda, or for that matter to any form of unhealthy emotionalism. Now, I wonder. Yes? What if the Pacific Project is just that? I mean, a huge device to keep us off balance. Something top secret, but meant to leak out in just the right fashion, so that the outer worlds yield a little to Earth, simply in order to play safe. There was a longish silence. Impossible, burst out Maynard, angrily. You react properly. You hesitate. But I don't seriously press the interpretation. It is merely a thought. A longer silence, then Huckman spoke again. Are there any other questions? Maynard started out of a reverie. No. No. The wave broke off and a wall appeared where space had been a moment before. Slowly, with stubborn disbelief, Franklin Maynard shook his head. Ernest Kalin mounted the stairs with a feeling for all the past centuries. The building was old, cobwebbed with history. It once housed the Parliament of Man, and from it words went out that clanged throughout the stars. It was a tall building. It soared, stretched, strained. Out and up to the stars, it reached. To the stars that had now turned away. It no longer even housed the Parliament of Earth. That had now been switched to a newer, neoclassical building, one that imperfectly aped the architectural stylisms of the ancient pre-atomic age. Yet the older building still held its great name. Officially, it was still Stellar House, but it only housed the functionaries of a shriveled bureaucracy now. Kalin got out at the 12th floor, and the lift dropped quickly down behind him. The radiant sign said smoothly and quietly, Bureau of Information. He handed a letter to the receptionist. He waited. And eventually, he passed through the door which said, L.Z. Celioni, Secretary of Information. Celioni was little and dark. His hair was thick and black, his mustache thin and black. His teeth, when he smiled, were startlingly white and even, so he smiled often. He was smiling now, as he rose and held out his hand. Kalin took it, then an offered seat, then an offered cigar. Celioni said, I am very happy to see you, Mr. Kalin. It is kind of you to fly here from New York on such short notice. Kalin curved the corners of his lips down and made a tiny gesture with one hand, deprecating the whole business. And now, continued Celioni, I presume you would like an explanation of all this. I wouldn't refuse one, said Kalin. Unfortunately, it is difficult to know exactly how to explain. As Secretary of Information, my position is difficult. I must safeguard the security and well-being of Earth and, at the same time, observe our traditional freedom of the press. Naturally, and fortunately, we have no censorship, but just as naturally, there are times when we could almost wish we did have. Is this?" asked Kalin, with reference to me. "About censorship, I mean?" Seleone did not answer directly. Instead, he smiled again, slowly, and with a remarkable absence of joviality. He said, "You, Mr. Kalin, have one of the most widely heard and influential telecasts on the video. Therefore, you are of peculiar interest to the government." "The time is mine," said Kalin, stubbornly. "I pay for it. I pay taxes on the income I derive from it. I adhere to all the common law rulings on taboos. So I don't quite see of what interest I can be to the government." "Oh, you misunderstand me. It's my fault, I suppose, for not being clearer. You have committed no crime, broken no laws. I have only admiration for your journalistic ability. What I refer to is your editorial attitude at times." "With respect to what?" "With respect," said Seleone, with a sudden harshness about his thin lips, "to our policy toward the outer worlds. My editorial attitude represents what I feel and think, Mr. Secretary. I allow this. You have your right to your feelings and your thoughts. Yet it is injudicious to spread them about nightly to an audience of 500 million. Injudicious, according to you, perhaps. But legal, according to anybody. It is sometimes necessary to place good of country above a strict and selfish interpretation of legality." Kalin tapped his foot twice and frowned blackly. "Look," he said, "put this frankly. What is it you want?" The Secretary of Information spread his hands out before him. "In a word, cooperation. Really, Mr. Kalin, we can't have you weakening the will of the people. Do you appreciate the position of Earth? 6 billions, and a declining food supply. It is insupportable. And emigration is the only solution. No patriotic Earthman can fail to see the justice of our position. No reasonable human being anywhere can fail to see the justice of it." Kalin said, "I agree with your premise that the population problem is serious, but emigration is not the only solution. In fact, emigration is the one sure way of hastening destruction." "Really? And why do you say that?" "Because the outer worlds will not permit emigration, and you can force their hand by war only. And we cannot win a war." "Tell me," said Seleone softly, "have you ever tried emigrating? It seems to me you could qualify. You are quite tall, rather light-haired, intelligent." The video man flushed. He said, curtly, "I have hay fever." "Well," and the secretary smiled, "then you must have good reason for disapproving their arbitrary genetic and racist policies." Kalin replied with heat, "I won't be influenced by personal motives. I would disapprove their policies, if I qualified perfectly for emigration. But my disapproval would alter nothing. Their policies are their policies, and they can enforce them. Moreover, their policies have some reason even if wrong. Mankind is starting again on the outer worlds, and they, the ones who got there first, would like to eliminate some of the flaws of the human mechanism that have become obvious with time. A hay fever sufferer is a bad egg, genetically. A cancer-prone even more so. Their prejudices against skin and hair colors are, of course, senseless, but I can grant that they are interested in uniformity and homogeneity. And as for Earth, we can do much even without the help of the outer worlds. For instance, what? Positronic robots and hydroponic farming should be introduced, and, most of all, birth control must be instituted. Unintelligent birth control, that is, based on firm psychiatric principles intended to eliminate the psychotic trends, congenital infirmities. As they do in the outer worlds. Not at all. I have mentioned no racist principles. I talk only of mental and physical infirmities that are held in common by all ethnic and racial groups. And most of all, births must be held below deaths until a healthful equilibrium is reached. Seleone said, grimly, "We lack the industrial techniques and the resources to introduce a robot hydroponic technology in anything less than 5 centuries. Furthermore, the traditions of Earth, as well as current ethical beliefs, forbid robot labor and false foods. Most of all, they forbid the slaughter of unborn children. Now, come, Kalin, we can't have you pouring this out over video. It won't work. It distracts the attention. It weakens the will. Kalin broke in, impatiently. "Mr. Secretary, do you want war?" "Do I want war? That is an impudent question. Then, who are the policy makers in the government who do want war? For instance, who is responsible for the calculated rumor of the Pacific Project?" "The Pacific Project? And where did you hear of that?" "My sources are my secret." "Then, I'll tell you. You heard of this Pacific Project from Marianu of Aurora on his recent trip to Earth. We know more about you than you suppose, Mr. Kalin. I believe that, but I do not admit that I received information from Marianu. Why do you think I could get information from him? Is it because he was deliberately allowed to learn of this piece of trumpery?" "Trumpery?" "Yes. I think Pacific Project is a fake. A fake meant to inspire confidence. I think the government plans to let the so-called secret leak out in order to strengthen its war policy. It is part of a war of nerves on Earth's own people, and it will be the ruin of Earth in the end. And I will take this theory of mine to the people." "You will not, Mr. Kalin," said Salioni, quietly. "I will. Mr. Kalin, your friend, Ion Marianu is having his troubles on Aurora, perhaps for being too friendly with you. Take care that you do not have equal trouble for being too friendly with him." "I'm not worried." The video man laughed shortly, lunged to his feet and strode to the door. Kalin smiled very gently when he found the door blocked by two large men. "You mean, I am under arrest right now?" "Exactly," said Salioni. "On what charge?" "We'll think of some later." Kalin left, under escort. On Aurora, the mirror image of the aforedescribed events was taking place, and on a larger scale. The Foreign Agents Committee of the Gathering had been meeting now for days, ever since the session of the Gathering in which Ion Marianu and his Conservative Party made their great bid to force a vote of no confidence. That it had failed was in part due to the superior political generalship of the independents, and in some part due to the activity of this same Foreign Agents Committee. For months now, the evidence had been accumulating, and when the vote of confidence turned out to be sizably in favor of the independents, the committee was able to strike in its own way. Marianu was subpoenaed in his own home, and placed under house arrest. Although this procedure of house arrest was not, under the circumstances, legal, a fact emphatically pointed out by Marianu, it was nevertheless successfully accomplished. For 3 days Marianu was cross-examined thoroughly, in polite, even tones that scarcely ever veered from unemotional curiosity. The 7 inquisitors of the committee took turns in questioning, but Marianu had respite only for 10-minute intervals during the hours in which the committee sat. After 3 days, he showed the effects. He was hoarse with demanding that he be faced with his accusers, weary with insisting that he be informed of the exact nature of the charges, throat-broken with shouting against the illegality of the procedure. The committee finally read statements at him. "Is this true or not? Is this true or not?" Marianu could merely shake his head wearily as the structure spidered about him. He challenged the competency of the evidence and was smoothly informed that the proceedings constituted a committee investigation and not a trial. The chairman clapped his gavel, finally. He was a broad man of tremendous purpose. He spoke for an hour in his final summing up of the results of the inquiry, but only a relatively short portion of it need be quoted. He said, "If you had merely conspired with others on Aurora, we could understand you, even forgive you. Such a fault would have been held in common with many ambitious men in history. It is not that at all. What horrifies us and removes all pity is your eagerness to consort with the disease-ridden, ignorant and subhuman remnants of Earth. You, the accused, stand here under a heavy weight of evidence showing you to have conspired with the worst elements of Earth's mongrel population." The chairman was interrupted by an agonized cry from Marianu, "But the motive? What motive can you possibly attribute?" The accused was pulled back into his seat. The chairman pursed his lips and departed from the slow gravity of his prepared speech to improvise a bit. "It is not," he said, "for this committee to go into your motives. We have shown the facts of the case. The committee does have evidence." He paused, and looked along the line of the members to the right and the left, then continued. I think I may say that the committee has evidence that points to your intentions to use Earth manpower to engineer a coup that would leave you dictator over Aurora. But since the evidence has not been used, I will go no further into that, except to say that such a consummation is not inconsistent with your character as displayed at these hearings. He went back to his speech. Those of us who sit here have heard, I think, of something termed the Pacific Project, which, according to rumors, represents an attempt on the part of Earth to retrieve its lost dominions. It is needless to emphasize here that any such attempt must be doomed to failure. And yet defeat for us is not entirely inconceivable. One thing can cause us to stumble, and that one thing is an unsuspected internal weakness. Genetics is, after all, still an imperfect science. Even with 20 generations behind us, undesirable traits may crop up at scattered points, and each represents a flaw in the steel shield of Aurora's strength. That is the Pacific Project, the use of our own criminals and traitors against us. And if they can find such in our inner councils, the Earthmen might even succeed. The Foreign Agents Committee exists to combat that threat. In the accused, we touch the fringes of the web. We must go on. The speech did, at any rate. When it was concluded, Mariano, pale, wide-eyed, pounded his fist. I demand my say. The accused may speak, said the chairman. Mariano rose and looked about him for a long moment. The room, fitted for an audience of 75 million by community wave, was unattended. There were the inquisitors, legal staff, official recorders, and with him, in the actual flesh, his guards. He would have done better with an audience. To whom could he otherwise appeal? His glance fled hopelessly from each face it touched, but could find nothing better. First, he said, I deny the legality of this meeting. My constitutional rights of privacy and individuality have been denied. I have been tried by a group without standing as a court, by individuals convinced, in advance, of my guilt. I have been denied adequate opportunity to defend myself. In fact, I have been treated throughout as an already convicted criminal requiring only sentence. I deny, completely and without reservation, that I have been engaged in any activity detrimental to the state or tending to subvert any of its fundamental institutions. I accuse, vigorously and unreservedly, this committee of deliberately using its powers to win political battles. I am guilty not of treason, but of disagreement. I disagree with a policy dedicated to the destruction of the larger part of the human race for reasons that are trivial and inhumane. Rather than destruction, we owe assistance to these men who are condemned to a harsh, unhappy life solely because it was our ancestors and not theirs who happened to reach the outer worlds first. With our technology and resources, they can yet recreate and redevelop. The chairman's voice rose above the intense near whisper of Mariano, you are out of order. The committee is quite prepared to hear any remarks you make in your own defense, but a sermon on the rights of Earthmen is outside the legitimate realm of the discussion. The hearings were formally closed. It was a great political victory for the independents. All would agree to that. Of the members of the committee, only Franklin Maynard was not completely satisfied. A small, nagging doubt remained. He wondered. Should he try, one last time? Should he speak once more and then no more to that queer little monkey ambassador from Earth? He made his decision quickly and acted upon it instantly. Only a pause to arrange a witness, since even for himself and in witness private communion with an Earthman might be dangerous. Luz Moreno, ambassador to Aurora from Earth, was, to put not too fine a point on it, a miserable figure of a man. And that wasn't exactly an accident. On the whole, the foreign diplomats of Earth tended to be dark, short, wizen, or weakly, or all four. That was only self-protection, since the outer worlds exerted strong attraction for any Earthman. Diplomats exposed to the allure of Aurora, for instance, could not but be exceedingly reluctant to return to Earth. Worse, and more dangerous, exposure meant a growing sympathy with the demigods of the stars and a growing alienation from the slum dwellers of Earth. Unless, of course, the ambassador found himself rejected. unless he found himself somewhat despised. And then, no more faithful servant of Earth could be imagined, no man less subject to corruption. The ambassador to Earth was only 5'2", with a bald head and receding forehead, a pinkish affectation of beard and red-rimmed eyes. He was suffering from a slight cold, the occasional results whereof he smothered in a handkerchief. And yet, withal, he was a man of intellect. To Franklin Maynard, the sight and sound of the Earthman was distressing. He grew queasy at each cough and shuddered when the ambassador wiped his nose. Maynard said, "Your Excellency, we come in at my request because I wish to inform you that the gathering has decided to ask your recall by your government." "That is kind of you, Counselor. I had an inkling of this." "And for what reason?" "The reason is not within the bounds of discussion. I believe it is the prerogative of a sovereign state to decide for itself whether a foreign representative shall be persona grata or not. Nor do I think you really need enlightenment on this matter." "Very well, then." The ambassador paused to wield his handkerchief and murmur an apology. "Is that all?" Maynard said, "Not quite. There are matters I would like to mention." "Remain." The ambassador's reddened nostrils flared a bit, but he smiled, and said, "An honor." "Your world, Excellency," said Maynard, superciliously, "displays a certain belligerence of late that we on Aurora find most annoying and unnecessary. I trust that you will find your return to Earth at this point a convenient opportunity to use your influence against further displays such as recently occurred in New York, where 2 Aurorans were manhandled by a mob. The payment of an indemnity may not be enough the next time." "But that is emotional overflow, Councillor Maynard. Surely, you cannot consider youngsters shouting in the streets to be adequate representations of belligerence. It is backed by your government's actions in many ways. The recent arrest of Mr. Ernest Callan, for instance." "Which is a purely domestic affair," said the ambassador, quietly. "But not one to demonstrate a reasonable spirit toward the outer worlds. Callan was one of the few Earthmen who until recently could yet make their voices heard. He was intelligent enough to realize that no divine right protects the inferior man simply because he is inferior." The ambassador arose. "I am not interested in Oran theories on racial differences." "A moment. Your government may realize that much of their plans have gone awry with the arrest of your agent, Marianu. Stress the fact that we of Aurora are much wiser than we have been prior to this arrest. It may serve to give them pause." "Is Marianu my agent?" "Really, Counselor, if I am disaccredited, I shall leave." "But surely the loss of diplomatic immunity does not affect my personal immunity as an honest man from charges of espionage. Isn't that your job? Do Aurorans take it for granted that espionage and diplomacy are identical? My government will be glad to hear it. We shall take appropriate precautions." "Then, you defend Marianu? You deny that he has been working for Earth?" "I defend only myself. As to Marianu, I am not stupid enough to say anything." "Why stupid? Wouldn't a defense by myself be but another indictment against him?" "I neither accuse nor defend him. Your government's quarrel with Marianu, like my government's with Callan, whom you, by the way, are most suspiciously eager to defend, is an internal affair. I will leave now." The communion broke, and almost instantly the wall faded again. Hoekman was looking thoughtfully at Maynard. "What do you think of him?" asked Maynard, grimly. "Disgraceful that such a travesty of humanity should walk Aurora, I think." "I agree with you, and yet. Well? And yet I can almost find myself able to think that he is the master and that we dance to his piping." "You know of Marianu?" "Of course." "Well, he will be convicted, sent to an asteroid. His party will be broken. Offhand, anyone would say that such actions represent a horrible defeat for Earth. Is there doubt in your mind that such is the case?" "I'm not sure." Committee Chairman Hunt insisted on airing his theory that Pacific Project was the name Earth gave to a device for using internal traders on the outer worlds. "But I don't think so. I'm not sure the facts fit that. For instance, where did we get our evidence against Marianu? I certainly can't say. Our agents, in the first place, But how did they get it? The evidence was a little too convincing. Marino could have guarded himself better. Maynard hesitated. He seemed to be attempting a blush, and failing. Well, to put it quickly, I think it was the terrestrian ambassador who somehow presented us with the most evidence. I think that he played on Marino's sympathy for Earth first to befriend him and then to betray him. Why? I don't know. To ensure war, perhaps, with this Pacific project waiting for us. I don't believe it. I know. I have no proof. Nothing but suspicion. The committee wouldn't believe me either. It seemed to me, perhaps, that a last talk with the ambassador might reveal something, but his mere appearance antagonizes me, and I find I spend most of my time trying to remove him from my sight. Well, you are becoming emotional, my friend. It is a disgusting weakness. I hear that you have been appointed a delegate to the interplanetary gathering at Hesperus. I congratulate you. Thanks, said Maynard, absently. Luz Marino, ex-ambassador to Aurora, had been glad to return to Earth. He was away from the artificial landscapes that seemed to have no life of their own, but to exist only by virtue of the strong will of their possessors. Away from the two beautiful men and women and from their ubiquitous, brooding robots. He was back to the hum of life and the shuffle of feet. The brushing of shoulders and the feeling of breath in the face. Not that he was able to enjoy these sensations entirely. The first days had been spent in lively conferences with the heads of Earth's government. In fact, it was not till nearly a week had passed, that an hour came in which he could consider himself truly relaxed. He was in the rarest of all appurtenances of terrestrial luxury, a roof garden. With him was Gustav Stein, the quite obscure physiologist, who was, nevertheless, one of the prime movers of the plan, known to rumor as the Pacific Project. The confirmatory tests, said Marino, with an almost dreadful satisfaction, all check so far, do they not? So far. Only so far. We have miles to go. Yet they will continue to go well. To one who has lived on Aurora for nearly a year, as I have, there can be no doubt but that we're on the right track. Nevertheless, I will go only by the laboratory reports. And quite rightly. His little body was almost stiff with gloating. Someday, it will be different. Stein, you have not met these men, these outer-worlders. You may have come across the tourists, perhaps, in their special hotels, or riding through the streets in enclosed cars, equipped with the purest of private, air-conditioned atmospheres for their well-bred nostrils. Observing the sights through a movable periscope and shuddering away from the touch of an Earthman. But you have not met them on their own world, secure in their own sickly, rotting greatness. Go, Stein, and be despised a while. Go, and find how well you can compete with their own trained lawns as something to be gently trod upon. And yet, when I pulled the proper chords, Ion Marino fell, Ion Marino, the only man among them with the capacity to understand the workings of another's mind. It is the crisis that we have passed now. We front a smooth path now. Satisfaction. Satisfaction. As for Kalin, he said suddenly, more to himself than to Stein, he can be turned loose now. There little he can say, hereafter, that can endanger anything. In fact, I have an idea. The Interplanetary Conference opens on Hesperus within a month. He can be sent to report the meeting. It will be an earnest of our friendliness, and keep him away for the summer. I think it can be arranged. It was. Of all the outer worlds, Hesperus was the smallest, the latest settled, the furthest from Earth. Hence the name. In a physical sense, it was not best suited to a great diplomatic gathering, since its facilities were small. For instance, the available community wave network could not possibly be stretched to cover all the delegates, secretarial staff, and administrators necessary in a convocation of 50 planets. So meetings in person were arranged in buildings impressed for the purpose. Yet there was a symbolism in the choice of meeting place that escaped practically nobody. Hesperus, of all the worlds, was furthest removed from Earth. But the spatial distance 100 parsecs or more, was the least of it. The important point was that Hesperus had been colonized not by Earthmen, but by men from the outer world of Faunus. It was therefore of the second generation, and so it had no Mother Earth. Earth to it was but a vague grandmother, lost in the stars. As is usual in all such gatherings, little work is actually done on the session floors. That space is reserved for the official soundings of whatever is primarily intended for home ears. The actual swapping and horse trading takes place in the lobbies and at the lunch tables, and many of irresolvable conflict has softened over the soup and vanished over the nuts. And yet particular difficulties were present in this particular case. Not on all worlds was the community wave as paramount and all-pervading as it was on Aurora, but it was prominent in all. It was, therefore, with a certain sense of outrage and loss that the tall, dignified men found it necessary to approach one another in the flesh, without the comforting privacy of the invisible wall between, without the warm knowledge of the brake switch at their fingertips. They faced one another in uneasy semi-embarrassment and tried not to watch one another eat. Tried not to shrink at the unmean touch. Even robot service was rationed. Ernest Kalin, the only accredited video representative from Earth, was aware of some of these matters only in the vague way they are described here. A more precise insight he could not have. Nor could anyone brought up in a society where human beings exist only in the plural, and where a house need only be deserted to be feared. So it was that certain of the most subtle tensions escaped him at the formal dinner party given by the Hesperian government during the third week of the conference. Other tensions, however, did not pass him by. The gathering after the dinner naturally fell apart into little groups. Kalin joined the one that contained Franklin Maynard of Aurora. As the delegate of the largest of the worlds, he was naturally the most newsworthy. Maynard was speaking casually between sips at the tawny Hesperian cocktail in his hand. If his flesh crawled slightly at the closeness of the others, he masked the feeling masterfully. Earth, he said, is, in essence, helpless against us if we avoid unpredictable military adventures. Economic unity is actually a necessity, if we intend to avoid such adventures. Let Earth realize to how great an extent her economy depends upon us, on the things that we alone can supply her, and there will be no more talk of living space. And if we are united, Earth would never dare attack. She will exchange her barren longings for atomic motors, or not, as she pleases. And he turned to regard Kalin with a certain hauteur as the other found himself stung to comment, "But your manufactured goods, counselor, I mean those you ship to Earth, they are not given us. They are exchanged for agricultural products." Maynard smiled silkily. "Yes, I believe the delegate from Tethys has mentioned that fact at length. There is a delusion prevalent among some of us that only terrestrial seeds grow properly." He was interrupted calmly by another, who said, "Now, I am not from Tethys, but what you mention is not a delusion. I grow rye on Rhea, and I have never yet been able to duplicate terrestrial bread. It just hasn't got the same taste." He addressed the audience in general. "In fact, I imported half a dozen terrestrians 5 years back on agricultural labor visas so they could oversee the robots. Now, they can do wonders with the land, you know. Where they spit, corn grows 15 feet high. Well, that helped a little. And using terrestrian seed helped. But even if you grow terrestrian grain, its seed won't hold the next year. Has your soil been tested by your government's agricultural department?" asked Maynard. The Rhian grew hearty in his turn, "No better soil in the sector. And the rye is top grade. I even sent 100 weight down to Earth for nutritional clearance, and it came back with full marks." He rubbed one side of his chin, thoughtfully. "It's flavor I'm talking about. Doesn't seem to have the right." Maynard made an effort to dismiss him. "Flavor is dispensable temporarily. They'll be coming to us on our terms, these little men hordes of Earth, when they feel the pinch. We give up only this mysterious flavor, but they will have to give up empowered engines, farm machinery, and ground cars. It wouldn't be a bad idea, in fact, to attempt to get along without the terrestrian flavors you are so concerned about. Let us appreciate the flavor of our homegrown products instead, which could stand comparison if we gave it a chance. It's so?" The Rian smiled. "I notice you're smoking earth-grown tobacco. A habit I can break if I have to. Probably by giving up smoking. I wouldn't use outer-world tobacco for anything but killing mosquitoes." He laughed a trifle too boisterously, and left the group. Maynard stared after him, a little pinch-nosed. To Kalen, the little bee play over Ryan tobacco brought a certain satisfaction. He regarded such personalities as the tiny reflection of certain galactopolitical realities. Tethys and Rhea were the largest planets in the galactic south, as Aurora was the largest in the galactic north. All three planets were identically racist, identically exclusivist. Their views on Earth were similar and completely compatible. Ordinarily, one would think that there was no room to quarrel. But Aurora was the oldest of the outer worlds, the most advanced, the strongest militarily, and, therefore, aspired to a sort of moral leadership of all the worlds. That was sufficient in itself to rouse opposition, and Rhea and Tethys served as focal points for those who did not recognize Auroran leadership. Kalen was somberly grateful for that situation. If Earth could but lean her weight properly, first in one direction, then in the other, an ultimate split, or even fragmentation. He eyed Maynard cautiously, almost furtively, and wondered what effect this would have on the next day's debate. Already, the Auroran was more silent than was quite polite. And then some undersecretary or sub-official threaded his way through the clusters of guests in finicky fashion, and beckoned to Maynard. Kalen's following eyes watched the Auroran retreat with the newcomer, watched him listen closely, mouth a startled "what?" That was quite visible to the eye, though too far off to be heard, and then reach for a paper that the other handed him. And as a result, the next day's session of the conference went entirely differently than Kalen would have predicted. Kalen discovered the details in the evening videocasts. The Terrestrian government, it seemed, had sent a note to all the governments attending the conference. It warned each one bluntly that any agreement among them in military or economic affairs would be considered an unfriendly act against Earth and that it would be met with appropriate countermeasures. The note denounced Aurora, Tethys and Rhea all equally. It accused them of being engaged in an imperialist conspiracy against Earth, and so on, and on, and on. "Fools!" gritted Kalen, all but butting his head against the wall out of sheer chagrin. "Fools! Fools! Fools!" And his voice died away, still muttering that same one word. The next session of the conference was well and early attended by a set of angry delegates who were only too eager to grind into nothingness the disagreements still outstanding. When it ended, all matters concerning trade between Earth and the outer worlds had been placed in the hands of a commission with plenary powers. Not even Aurora could have expected so complete and easy a victory, and Kalen, on his way back to Earth, longed for his voice to reach the video, so that it could be to others, and not to himself only, that he could shout his disgust. Yet, on Earth, some men smiled. Once back on Earth, the voice of Kalen slowly swirled under and down, lost in the noisier clamor that shouted for action. His popularity sank in proportion as trade restrictions grew. Slowly, the outer worlds drew the noose tighter. First, they instituted a strict application of a new system of export licensing. Secondly, they banned the export to Earth of all materials capable of being used in a war effort. And finally they applied a very broad interpretation indeed of what could be considered usable in such a connection. Imported luxuries, and imported necessities, too, for that matter, vanished or priced themselves upwards out of the reach of all but the very few. So the people marched, and the voices shouted and the banners swung about in the sunlight, and the stones flew at the consulates. Kalen shouted hoarsely and felt as if he were going mad. Until, suddenly, Luz Moreno, quite of his own accord, offered to appear on Kalen's program and submit to unrestricted questioning in his capacity as ex-ambassador to Aurora and present secretary without portfolio. To Kalen it had had all the possibilities of a rebirth. He knew Moreno, no fool, he. With Moreno on his program, he was assured an audience as great as his greatest. With Moreno answering questions, certain misapprehensions might be removed, certain confusions might be straightened. The mere fact that Moreno wished to use his program as sounding board might well mean that already a more pliant and sensible foreign policy might have been decided upon. Perhaps Maynard was correct, and the pinch was being felt and was working as predicted. The list of questions had, of course, been submitted to Moreno in advance, but the ex-ambassador had indicated that he would answer all of them and any follow-up questions that might seem necessary. It seemed quite ideal. Too ideal, perhaps, but only a criminal fool could worry over minutiae at this point. There was an adequate ballyhoo, and when they faced one another across the little table, the red needle that indicated the number of video sets drawing power on that channel hovered well over the 200 million mark. And there was an average of 2.7 listeners per video set. Now the theme. The official introduction. Kalin rubbed his cheek slowly, as he waited for the signal. Then, he began, question. Secretary Moreno, the question which interests all Earth at the moment, concerns the possibility of war. Suppose we start with that. Do you think there will be war? Answer. If Earth is the only planet to be considered, I say, no, definitely not. In its history, Earth has had too much war, and has learned many times over how little can be gained by it. Question. You say, if Earth is the only planet to be considered. Do you imply that factors outside our control will bring war? Answer. I do not say will. But I could say may. I cannot, of course, speak for the outer worlds. I cannot pretend to know their motivations and intentions at this critical moment in galactic history. They may choose war. I hope not. If so be that they do, however, we will defend ourselves. But in any case, we will never attack. We will not strike the first blow. Question. Am I right in saying, then, that in your opinion there are no basic differences between Earth and the outer worlds, which cannot be solved by negotiation? Answer. You certainly are. If the outer worlds were sincerely desirous of a solution, no disagreement between them and us could long exist. Question. Does that include the question of immigration? Answer. Definitely. Our own role in the matter is clear and beyond reproach. As matters stand, 200 million human beings now occupy 95% of the available land in the universe. 6 billions, that is, 97% of all mankind, are squeezed into the other 5%. Such a situation is obviously unjust and, worse, unstable. Yet Earth, in the face of such injustice, has always been willing to treat this problem as soluble by degrees. It is still so willing. We should agree to reasonable quotas and reasonable restrictions. Yet the outer worlds have refused to discuss this matter. Over a space of 5 decades, they have rebuffed all efforts on the part of Earth to open negotiations. Question. If such an attitude on the part of the outer worlds continues, do you then think there will be war? Answer. I cannot believe that this attitude will continue. Our government will not cease hoping that the outer worlds will eventually reconsider their stand on the matter. That their sense of justice and right is not dead, but only sleeping. Question. Mr. Secretary, let us pass on to another subject. Do you think that the United Worlds Commission set up by the outer worlds recently to control trade with Earth represents a danger to peace? Answer. In the sense that its actions indicate a desire on the part of the outer worlds to isolate Earth, and to weaken it economically, I can say that it does. Question. To what actions do you refer, sir? Answer. To its actions in restricting interstellar trade with Earth to the point where, in credit values, the total stands now at less than 10% of what it did 3 months ago. Question. But do such restrictions really represent an economic danger to Earth? For instance, is it not true that trade with the outer worlds represents an almost insignificant part of total terrestrial trade? And is it not true that the importations from the outer worlds reach only a tiny minority of the population at best? Answer. Your questions now are representative of a profound fallacy which is very common among our isolationists. In credit values, it is true that interstellar trade represents only 5% of our total trade, but 95% of our atomic engines are imported. 80% of our thorium, 65% of our cesium, 60% of our molybdenum and tin are imported. The list can be extended almost indefinitely, and it is quite easy to see that the 5% is an extremely important, a vital, 5%. Furthermore, if a large manufacturer receives a shipment of atomic steel shapers from Ria, it does not follow that the benefit redounds only to him. Every man on earth who uses steel implements or objects manufactured by steel implements benefits. Question. But is it not true that the current restrictions on Earth's interstellar trade have cut our grain and cattle exports to almost nothing? And far from harming Earth, isn't this really a boon to our own hungry people? Answer. This is another serious fallacy. That Earth's good food supply is tragically inadequate is true. The government would be the last to deny it. But our food exports do not represent any serious drain upon this supply. Less than 1/5 of Earth's food is exported, and in return we obtain, for instance, fertilizers and farm machinery which more than make up for that small loss by increasing agricultural efficiency. Therefore, by buying less food from us, the outer worlds are engaged, in effect, in cutting our already inadequate food supply. Question. Are you ready to admit, then, Secretary Moreno, that at least part of the blame for this situation should rest with Earth itself? In other words, we come to my next question, was it not a diplomatic blunder of the first magnitude for the government to issue its inflammatory note denouncing the intentions of the outer worlds before those intentions had been made clear at the Interplanetary Conference? Answer. I think those intentions were quite clear at the time. Question. I beg pardon, sir, but I was at the conference. At the time the note was issued, there was almost a stalemate among the outer world delegates. Those of Rhea and Tethys strongly opposed economic action against Earth, and there was considerable chance that Aurora and its bloc might have been defeated. Earth's note ended that possibility instantly. Answer. Well, what is your question, Mr. Kalin? Question. In view of my statements, do you or do you not think Earth's note to have been a criminal error of diplomacy which can now be made up only by a policy of intelligent conciliation? Answer. You use strong language. However, I cannot answer the question directly, since I do not agree with your major premise. I cannot believe that the delegates of the outer worlds could behave in the manner you describe. In the first place, it is well known that the outer worlds are proud of their boast that the percentage of insanity, psychoses and even relatively minor maladjustments of personality are almost at the vanishing point in their society. It is one of their strongest arguments against Earth, that we have more psychiatrists than plumbers and yet are more pinched for want of the former. The delegates to the conference represented the best of this so-called stable society. And now you would have me believe that these demi-gods would, in a moment of pique, have reversed their opinions and instituted a major change in the economic policy of 50 worlds. I cannot believe them capable of such childish and perverse activity, and must therefore insist that any action they took was based not upon any note from Earth, but upon motivations that go deeper. Question. But I saw the effect upon them with my own eyes, sir. Remember, they were being scolded in what they considered to be insolent language from an inferior people. There can be no doubt, sir, that as a whole, the men of the outer worlds are a remarkably stable people, despite your sarcasm, but their attitude toward Earth represents a weak point in this stability. Answer. Are you asking me questions, or are you defending the racist views and policies of the outer worlds? Question. Well, accepting your viewpoint that Earth's note did no harm, what good could it have done? Why should it have been sent? Answer. I think we were justified in presenting our side of the question before the bar of galactic public opinion. I believe we have exhausted the subject. What is your next question, please? It is the last, isn't it? Question. It is. It has recently been reported that the terrestrian government will take stern measures against those dealing in smuggling operations. Is this consistent with the government's view that lower trade relations are detrimental to Earth's welfare? Answer. Our primary concern is peace, and not our own immediate welfare. The outer worlds have adopted certain trade restrictions. We disapprove of them, and consider them a great injustice. Nevertheless, we shall adhere to them, so that no planet may say that we have given the slightest pretext for hostilities. For instance, I am privileged to announce here for the first time that in the past month, 5 ships, traveling under false Earth registry, were stopped while being engaged in the smuggling of outer-world material into Earth. Their goods were confiscated and their personnel imprisoned. This is an earnest of our good intentions. Question. Outer-world ships? Answer. Yes. But traveling under false Earth registry, remember. Question. And the men imprisoned are citizens of the outer worlds? Answer. I believe so. However, they were breaking not only our laws, but those of the outer worlds as well, and therefore doubly forfeited their interplanetary rights. I think the interview had better close, now. Question. But this. It was at this point that the broadcast came to a sudden end. The conclusion of Kalen's last sentence was never heard by anyone but Moreno. It ended like this. Means war. But Luz Moreno was no longer on the air. So as he drew on his gloves, he smiled and, with infinite meaning, shrugged his shoulders in a little gesture of indifference. There were no witnesses to that shrug. The gathering at Aurora was still in session. Franklin Maynard had dropped out for the moment in utter weariness. He faced his son, whom he now saw for the first time in naval uniform. "At least you're sure of what will happen, aren't you?" In the young man's response, there was no weariness at all, no apprehension. Nothing but utter satisfaction. "This is it, Dad." "Nothing bothers you, then? You don't think we've been maneuvered into this?" "Who cares if we have? It's Earth's funeral." Maynard shook his head, "But you realize that we've been put in the wrong. The outer world citizens they hold are lawbreakers. Earth is within its rights." His son frowned. "I hope you're not going to make statements like that to the gathering, Dad. I don't see that Earth is justified at all." "All right, what if smuggling was going on? It was just because some outer-worlders are willing to pay black market prices for terrestrial food. If Earth had any sense, she could look the other way, and everyone would benefit. She makes enough noise about how she needs our trade, so why doesn't she do something about it? Anyway, I don't see that we ought to leave any good Aurorans or other outer-worlders in the hands of those ape men. Since they won't give them up, we'll make them. Otherwise, none of us will be safe next time. I see that you've adopted the popular opinions, anyway. The opinions are my own. If they're popular opinion also, it's because they make sense. Earth wants a war. Well, they'll get it. But why do they want a war, eh? Why do they force our hands? Our entire economic policy of the past months was only intended to force a change in their attitude without war." He was talking to himself, but his son answered with the final argument, "I don't care why they wanted war. They've got it now, and we're going to smash them." Maynard returned to the gathering, but even as the drone of debate refilled the room, he thought, with a twinge, that there would be no terrestrian alfalfa that year. He regretted the milk. In fact, even the beef seemed, somehow, to be just a little less savory. The vote came in the early hours of the morning. Aurora declared war. Most of the worlds of the Aurora block joined it by dawn. In the history books, the war was later known as the 3 Weeks' War. In the first week, Auroran forces occupied several of the trans-Plutonian asteroids, and at the beginning of the third week, the bulk of Earth's home fleet was all but completely destroyed in a battle within the orbit of Saturn by an Aurora fleet not 1/4 its size, numerically. Declarations of war from the outer worlds yet neutral followed like the pop-pop of a string of firecrackers. On the 21st day of the war, lacking 2 hours, Earth surrendered. The negotiations of peace terms took place among the outer worlds. Earth's activities were concerned with signing only. The conditions of peace were unusual, perhaps unique, and under the force of an unprecedented humiliation, all the hordes of Earth seemed suddenly struck with a silence that came from ashamed anger too strong for words. The terms mentioned were perhaps best commented upon by a voice on the Auroran video 2 days after they were made public. It can be quoted in part. "There is nothing in or on Earth that we of the outer worlds can need or want. All that was ever worthwhile on Earth left it centuries ago in the persons of our ancestors. They call us the children of Mother Earth, but that is not so, for we are the descendants of a Mother Earth that no longer exists, a mother that we brought with us. The Earth of today bears us at best a cousinly relation. No more. Do we want their resources? Why, they have none for themselves. Can we use their industry or science? They are almost dead for lack of ours. Can we use their manpower? 10 of them are not worth a single robot. Do we even want the dubious glory of ruling them? There is no such glory. As our helpless and incompetent inferiors, they would be only a drag upon us. They would divert from our own use food, labor and administrative ability. So they have nothing to give us but the space they occupy in our thought. They have nothing to free us from but themselves. They cannot benefit us in any way other than in their absence. It is for that reason that the peace terms have been defined as they have been. We wish them no harm, so let them have their own solar system. Let them live there in peace. Let them mold their own destiny in their own way, and we will not disturb them thereby even the least hint of our presence. But we in turn want peace. We in turn would guide our own future in our own way. So we do not want their presence. And with that end in view, an outer world fleet will patrol the boundaries of their system. Outer world bases will be established on their outermost asteroids, so that we may make sure they do not intrude on our territory. There will be no trade, no diplomatic relationships, no travel, no communications. They are fenced off, locked out, hermetically sealed away. Out here we have a new universe, a second creation of man, a higher man. They ask us, what will become of Earth? We answer, that is Earth's problem. Population growth can be controlled. Resources can be efficiently exploited. Economic systems can be revised. We know, for we have done so. If they cannot, let them go the way of the dinosaur, and make room. Let them make room, instead of forever demanding room. And so an impenetrable curtain swung slowly shut about the solar system. The stars in Earth's sky became only stars again, as in the long dead days before the first ship had penetrated the barrier of light speed. The government that had made war and peace resigned, but there was no one, really, to take their place. The legislature elected Luz Moreno, ex-ambassador to Aurora, ex-secretary without portfolio, as president pro tem, and the Earth as a whole was too numb to agree or disagree. There was only a widespread relief that someone existed who would be willing to take the job of trying to guide the destinies of a world in prison. Very few realized how well planned an ending this was, or with what calculation Moreno found himself in the president's chair. Ernest Kalin said hopelessly from the video screen, "We are only ourselves now. For us, there is no universe and no past, only Earth, and the future." That night he heard from Luz Moreno once again, and before morning he left for the capital. Moreno's presence seemed incongruent within the stiffly formal president's mansion. He was suffering from a cold again, and snuffled when he talked. Kalin regarded him with a self-terrifying hostility, an almost singeing hatred in which he could feel his fingers begin to twitch in the first gestures of choking. Perhaps he shouldn't have come. Well, what was the difference? The orders had been plain. If he had not come, he would have been brought. The new president looked at him sharply. "You have to alter your attitude towards me, Kalin. I know you regard me as one of the grave diggers of Earth, isn't that the phrase you used last night? But you must listen to me quietly for a while. In your present state of suppressed rage, I doubt if you could hear me. I will hear whatever you have to say, Mr. President." "Well, the external amenities, at least." "That's hopeful. Or do you think a video tracer is attached to the room?" Kalin merely lifted his eyebrows. Moreno said, "It isn't. You safely that it is being arranged for you to be elected president under a constitution now being devised." What's the matter?" Then he grinned at the look of bloodless amazement in Kalin's face. "Oh, You don't believe it? Well, it's past your stopping. And before an hour is up, you'll understand. I'm to be president? Kalen struggled with a strange, hoarse voice. Then, more firmly, you are mad. No. Not I. Those out there, rather. Out there in the outer worlds. There was a sudden vicious intensity in Moreno's eyes, and face, and voice, so that you forgot he was a little monkey of a man with a perpetual cold. You didn't notice the wrinkled, sloping forehead. You forgot the baldish head and ill-fitting clothes. There was only the bright and luminous look in his eyes, and the hard incision in his voice. That you noticed. Kalen reached blindly backward for a chair, as Moreno came closer and spoke with increasing intensity. Yes, said Moreno. Those out among the stars. The godlike ones. The stately supermen. The strong, handsome master race. They are mad. But only we on Earth know it. Come, you have heard of the Pacific Project. I know you have. You denounced it to Celione once, and called it a fake. But it isn't a fake. And almost none of it is a secret. In fact, the only secret about it was that almost none of it was a secret. You are no fool, Kalen. You just never stopped to work it all out. And yet you were on the track. You had the feel of it. What was it you said that time you were interviewing me on the program? Something about the attitude of the outer worldling toward the Earthman being the only flaw in the former's stability. That was it, wasn't it? Or something like that? Very well, then. Good. You had the first third of the Pacific Project in your mind at the time, and it was no secret after all, was it? Ask yourself, Kalen, what was the attitude of the typical Auroran to a typical Earthman? A feeling of superiority? That's the first thought, I suppose. But, tell me, Kalen, if he really felt superior, really superior, would it be so necessary for him to call such continuous attention to it? What kind of superiority is it that must be continuously bolstered by the constant repetition of phrases such as ape-men, sub-men, half-animals of Earth, and so on? That is not the calm internal assurance of superiority. Do you waste epithets on earthworms? No, there is something else there. Or let us approach it from another tack. Why do outer world tourists stay in special hotels, travel in enclosed ground cars, and have rigid, if unwritten, rules against social intermingling? Are they afraid of pollution? Strange, then, that they are not afraid to eat our food and drink our wine and smoke our tobacco. You see, Kalen, there are no psychiatrists on the outer worlds. The supermen are, so they say, too well adjusted. But here on Earth, as the proverb goes, there are more psychiatrists than plumbers, and they get lots of practice. So it is we, and not they, who know the truth about this outer world superiority complex, who know it to be simply a wild reaction against an overwhelming feeling of guilt. Don't you think that can be so? You shake your head as though you disagree. You don't see that a handful of men who clutch a galaxy while billions starve for lack of room must feel a subconscious guilt, no matter what? And, since they won't share the loot, don't you see that the only way they can justify themselves is to try to convince themselves that Earthmen, after all, are inferior, that they do not deserve the galaxy, that a new race of men have been created out there and that we here are only the diseased remnants of an old race that should die out like the dinosaur, through the working of inexorable natural laws? Ah, if they could only convince themselves of that, they would no longer be guilty, but merely superior. Only, it doesn't work. It never does. It requires constant bolstering, constant repetition, constant reinforcement. And still it doesn't quite convince. Best of all, if only they could pretend that Earth and its population do not exist at all. When you visit Earth, therefore, avoid Earthmen. Or they might make you uncomfortable by not looking inferior enough. Sometimes they might look miserable instead, and nothing more. Or worse still, they might even seem intelligent, as I did, for instance, on Aurora. Occasionally, an outer worlder like Moreno did crop up, and was able to recognize guilt for what it was without being afraid to say so out loud. He spoke of the duty the outer worlds owed Earth, and so he was dangerous to us. For if the others listened to him and had offered token assistance to Earth, their guilt might have been assuaged in their own minds. And that without any lasting help to Earth. So Maria Nu was removed through our web weaving, and the way left clear to those who were unbending, who refused to admit guilt, and whose reaction could therefore be predicted and manipulated. Send them an arrogant note, for instance, and they automatically strike back with a useless embargo that merely gives us the ideal pretext for war. Then lose a war quickly, and you are sealed off by the annoyed supermen. No communication, no contact. You no longer exist to annoy them. Isn't that simple? Didn't it work out nicely? Kellen finally found his voice, because Moreno gave him time by stopping. He said, "You mean that all this was planned? You did deliberately instigate the war for the purpose of sealing Earth off from the galaxy? You sent out the men of the home fleet to sure death because you wanted defeat? Why, you're a monster, Moreno frowned. Please relax. It was not as simple as you think, and I am not a monster. Do you think the war could simply be instigated? It had to be nurtured gently in just the right way and to just the right conclusion. If we had made the first move, if we had been the aggressor, if we had in any way put the fault on our side, why, they of the outer worlds would have occupied Earth and ground it under. They would no longer feel guilty, you see, if we committed a crime against them. Or, again, if we fought a protracted war, or one in which we inflicted damage, they could succeed in shifting the blame. But we didn't. We merely imprisoned our own smugglers, and were obviously within our rights. They had to go to war over it because only so could they protect their superiority, which in turn protected them against the horrors of guilt. And we lost quickly. Scarcely an Oran died. The guilt grew deeper and resulted in exactly the peace treaty our psychiatrists had predicted. And as for sending men out to die, that is a commonplace in every war, and a necessity. It was necessary to fight a battle, and, naturally, there were casualties. But why? Interrupted Kalen, wildly. Why? Why? Why does all this gibberish seem to make sense to you? What have we gained? What can we possibly gain out of the present situation? Gained, man? You ask what we've gained? Why, we've gained the universe. What has held us back so far? You know what Earth has needed these last centuries. You yourself once outlined it forcefully to Celione. We need a positronic robot society and an atomic power technology. We need chemical farming and we need population control. Well, what's prevented that, eh? Only the customs of centuries which said robots were evil since they deprived human beings of jobs, that population control was merely the murder of unborn children, and so on. And worse, there was always the safety valve of emigration, either actual or hoped for. But now we cannot emigrate. We're stuck here. Worse than that, we have been humiliatingly defeated by a handful of men out in the stars, and we've had a humiliating treaty of peace forced upon us. What Earthman wouldn't subconsciously burn for revenge? Self-preservation has frequently knuckled under to that tremendous yearning to get even. And that is the second third of the Pacific Project, the recognition of the revenge motive. As simple as that. And how can we know that this is really so? Why, it has been demonstrated in history scores of times. Defeat a nation, but don't crush it entirely, and in a generation or two or three it will be stronger than it was before. Why? Because in the interval, sacrifices will have been made for revenge that would not have been made for mere conquest. Think. Rome beat Carthage rather easily the first time, but was almost defeated the second. Every time Napoleon defeated the European coalition, he laid the groundwork for another just a little bit harder to defeat, until he himself was crushed by the eighth. It took 4 years to defeat Wilhelm of medieval Germany, and 6 much more dangerous years to stop his successor, Hitler. There you are. Until now, Earth needed to change its way of life only for greater comfort and happiness. A minor item like that could always wait. But now it must change for revenge, and that will not wait. And I want that change for its own sake. Only, I am not the man to lead. I am tarred with the failure of yesteryear, and will remain so until, long after I am bone dust, Earth learns the truth. But you, and others like you, have always fought for the road to modernization. You will be in charge. It may take 100 years. Grandchildren of men unborn may be the first to see its completion. But at least you will see the start. What do you say? Kalen was fumbling at the dream. He seemed to see it in a misty distance, a new and reborn Earth. But the change in attitude was too extreme. It could not be done just yet. He shook his head. He said, "What makes you think the outer worlds would allow such a change, supposing what you say to be true? They will be watching, I am sure, and they will detect a growing danger and put a stop to it. Can you deny that?" Moreno threw his head back and laughed noiselessly. He gasped out, "But we have still a third left of the Pacific Project, a last, subtle and ironic third. The outer worlders call the men of Earth the subhuman dregs of a great race, but we are the men of Earth. Do you realize what that means? We live on a planet upon which, for a billion years, the life that has culminated in mankind has been adapting itself. There is not a microscopic part of man, not a tiny working of his mind, that has not as its reason some tiny facet of the physical makeup of Earth, or of the biological makeup of Earth's other life forms, or of the sociological makeup of the society about him. No other planet can substitute for Earth, in man's present shape. The outer worlders exist as they do, only because pieces of Earth have been transplanted. Soil has been brought out there. Plants, animals, men. They keep themselves surrounded by an artificial Earth-born geology which has within it, for instance, those traces of cobalt, zinc and copper which human chemistry must have. They surround themselves by Earth-born bacteria and algae which have the ability to make those inorganic traces available in just the right way and in just the right quantity. And they maintain that situation by continued imports, luxury imports, they call it, from Earth. But on the outer worlds, even with terrestrian soil laid down to bedrock, they cannot keep rain from falling and rivers from flowing, so that there is an inevitable, if slow, admixture with the native soil. An inevitable contamination of terrestrian soil bacteria with the native bacteria, and an exposure, in any case, to a different atmosphere and to solar radiations of different types. Terrestrian bacteria disappear or change. And then plant life changes. And then animal life. No great change, mind you. Plant life would not become poisonous or non-nutritious in a day, or year, or decade. But already, the men of the outer worlds can detect the loss or change of the trace compounds that are responsible for that infinitely elusive thing we call flavor. It has gone that far. And it will go further. Do you know, for instance, that on Aurora, nearly one-half the native bacterial species known have protoplasm based on the fluorocarbon rather than hydrocarbon chemistry? Can you imagine the essential foreignness of such an environment? Well, for 2 decades now, the bacteriologists and physiologists of Earth have studied various forms of outer world life, the only portion of the Pacific Project that has been truly secret, and the transplanted terrestrian life is already beginning to show certain changes on the subcellular level. Even among the humans, and here is the irony. The outer worlders, by their rigid racism and unbending genetic policies, are consistently eliminating from among themselves any children that show signs of adapting themselves to their respective planets in any way that departs from the norm. They must maintain as a result of their own thought processes, an artificial criterion of healthy humanity, which is based on terrestrian chemistry and not their own. But now that Earth has been cut off from them, now that not even a trickle of terrestrian soil and life will reach them, change will be piled on change. Sicknesses will come, mortality will increase, child abnormalities will become more frequent. And then? Asked Kalen, suddenly caught up. And then? Well, they are physical scientists, leaving such inferior sciences as biology to us. And they cannot abandon their sensation of superiority and their arbitrary standard of human perfection. They will never detect the change till it is too late to fight it. Not all mutations are clearly visible, and there will be an increasing revolt against the mores of those stiff outer-world societies. There will be a century of increasing physical and social turmoil which will prevent any interference on their part with us. We will have a century of rebuilding and revitalization, and at the end of it, we shall face an outer galaxy which will either be dying or changed. In the first case, we will build a second terrestrian empire, more wisely and with greater knowledge than we did the first. One based on a strong and modernized Earth. In the second case, we will face perhaps 10, 20, or even all 50 outer worlds, each with a slightly different variety of man. 50 humanoid species, no longer united against us, each increasingly adapted to its own planet, each with a sufficient tendency toward atavism to love Earth, to regard it as the great and original mother. And racism will be dead, for variety will then be the great fact of humanity, and not uniformity. Each type of man will have a world of its own, for which no other world could quite substitute, and on which no other type could live quite as well. And other worlds can be settled to breed still newer varieties, until out of the grand intellectual mixture, Mother Earth will finally have given birth not to merely a terrestrian, but to a galactic empire. Kalin said, fascinated, "You foresee all this so certainly." Nothing is truly certain. But the best minds on Earth agree on this. There may be unforeseen stumbling blocks on the way, but to remove those will be the adventure of our great-grandchildren. Of our adventure, one phase has been successfully concluded. And another phase is beginning. Join us, Kalin. Slowly, Kalin began to think that perhaps Morena was not a monster after all.
This is Audible.
Darwinian Pool Room by Isaac Asimov. I'm John W. Michaels. Creation's meaning is an awesome secret, or maybe not. Of course, the ordinary conception of Genesis 1 is all wrong, I said. Take a pool room, for instance. The other three mentally took a pool room. We were sitting in broken-down swivel chairs in Dr. Trotter's laboratory. But it was no trick at all for them to convert the lab benches into pool tables, the tall ring stands into cues, the reagent bottles into billiard balls, and then wait for me to do something with the imaginary layout. Thedier even raised one finger, closed his eyes, and muttered softly, "Pool room." Trotter, as usual, said nothing at all, but nursed his second cup of coffee. The coffee, also as usual, was horrible, but then I was the newcomer to the group and had not yet calloused my gastric lining. "Now consider the end of a game of pocket pool," I said. "You've got each ball, except the cue ball, of course, in a given pocket." "Wait a while," said Thedier, always the purist. "It doesn't matter which pocket. Beside the point, when the game is over, the balls are in various pockets, right? Now suppose you walk into the pool room when the game is all over, and observe only that final position and try to reconstruct the course of previous events. You have several alternatives. None of you know the rules of the game," said Madden. "Assume complete ignorance," I said. "You can decide that the balls were pocketed by being struck with the cue ball, which in turn was struck by the cue. This would be the truth, but not an explanation that is very likely to occur to you spontaneously. It is much more likely that you would decide that the balls were individually placed in their corresponding pockets by hand, or always existed in the pockets as you found them." "All right," said Thedier. "If you're going to slip back to Genesis, you will claim that, by analogy, we can account for the universe as either having always existed, having been created arbitrarily as it is now, or having developed through evolution. So what?" "That's not the alternative I'm proposing at all," I said. "Let us accept the idea of creation for a purpose, and consider only the methods by which such a creation could have been accomplished. It's easy to suppose that God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. But it's not aesthetic." "It's simple," said Madden. And Occam's razor demands that of alternate possibilities. The simpler be chosen. Then why don't you play pool by putting the balls in the pocket by hand? That's simpler, too. But it isn't a game. Now, if you started with the primordial atom— "What is that?" asked Trotter craftily. "Well, call it all the mass energy of the universe compressed into a single sphere, in a state of minimum entropy, completely at rest, motionless. Now explode that in such a way that the constituent particles of matter and quanta of energy act, react, and interact in a precalculated way, so that just our present universe is created. Wouldn't that be much more satisfactory than simply waving your hand and saying, 'Let there be light'?" "You mean," said Madnid, "like stroking the cue ball against one of the billiard balls and sending all 15 into their pre-designated pockets." "In an aesthetic pattern," I said. "There's more poetry in the thought of a huge act of direct will," said Madnid. "That depends on whether you look at the matter as a mathematician or a theologian," I said. "As a matter of fact, Genesis 1 could be made to fit the billiard ball scheme. The Creator could have spent his time calculating all the necessary variables and relationships into 6 gigantic equations. Count 1 day for each equation. After having applied the initial explosive impetus, he would then rest on the 7th day, said 7th day being the entire interval of time from that beginning to 404 B.C., that interval in which the infinitely complex pattern of billiard balls is sorting itself out, is obviously of no interest to the writers of the Bible. All 2 billion years of it could be considered merely the developing single act of creation." "You are postulating a theological universe," said Trotter, "one in which purpose is implied." "Sure," I said. "Why not? The conscious act of creation without a purpose is ridiculous. Besides which, if you try to consider the course of evolution as the blind outcome of non-purposive forces, you end up with some very puzzling problems." "As for instance?" asked Madden. "As for instance," I said, "the passing away of the dinosaurs." "So hard to understand about that." "There's no logical reason for it. Try to name some." "Law of diminishing returns," said Madnid. "The brontosaurus got so massive it took legs like tree trunks to support him, and at that he had to stand in water and let buoyancy do most of the work. And he had to eat all the time to keep himself supplied with calories. I mean all the time. As for the carnivores, they afflicted such armor upon themselves in their race against one another, offensive and defensive, that they were just crawling tanks, puffing under tons of bone and scale. Got to the point where it just didn't pay off." "Okay," I said. "So the big babies die off. But most of the dinosaurs were little running creatures whose mass and armor had not become excessive. What happened to them?" "As far as the small ones are concerned," put in Theodore, "there's a question of competition. If some of the reptiles developed hair and warm blood, they could adapt themselves to variations in climate more efficiently. They wouldn't have to stay out of direct sunlight. They would not get sluggish as soon as the temperature dropped below 80 Fahrenheit. They would develop intelligence of a sort. Therefore they would win the race for food." "That doesn't satisfy me," I said. "In the first place, I don't think the various saurians were quite such pushovers. They held out for some 300 million years, you know, which is 299 more than genus Homo. Secondly, cold-blooded animals still survive, notably insects and amphibia." "High rate of reproduction," said Theodore, "and plenty of reptiles. The snakes, lizards, and turtles are still very much in business. For that matter, what about the ocean?" "Saurians adapted to that in the shape of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. They vanished, too, and there were no newly developed forms of life based on radical evolutionary advances to compete with them." As near as I can make out, the highest form of ocean life are the fish, mammals aside, and they came before the ichthyosaurs. How do you account for that? Fish are just as cold-blooded and even more primitive. And in the ocean there's no question of mass and diminishing returns, since the water does all the work of support. The sulphur-bottom whale is larger than any dinosaur that ever lived. Another thing, what's the use of talking about the inefficiency of cold blood and saying that at temperatures below 80, cold-blooded animals become sluggish? Fish are very happy at continuous temperatures of about 35, and there is nothing sluggish about a shark. Then why did the dinosaurs quietly steal off the earth, leaving their bones behind? Asked Madden. They were part of the plan. Once they had served their purpose, they were gotten rid of. How? In a properly arranged Velikovskian catastrophe? A striking comet? The finger of God? No, of course not. They died out naturally and of necessity according to the original pre-calculation. Then we ought to be able to find out what that natural, necessary cause of extinction was. Not necessarily. It might have been some obscure failure of the saurian biochemistry, deliberately provided for, some developing vitamin deficiency. It's too complicated, said Therier. It just seems complicated, I maintained. Supposing it were necessary to pocket a given billiard ball by making a 4-cushion shot, would you quibble at the complicated course of the cue ball? A direct hit would be less complicated, but would accomplish nothing. And, despite the apparent complication, the stroke would be no more difficult to master. It would still be a single motion of the cue, merely in a different direction. The ordinary properties of elastic materials and the laws of conservation of momentum would then take over. I take it, then, said Trotter, that you suggest that the course of evolution represents the simplest way in which one could have progressed from original chaos to man. That's right. Not a sparrow falls without a purpose, and not a pterodactyl either. And where do we go from here? Nowhere. Evolution is finished with the development of man. The old rules don't apply any more. Oh, don't they? Said Madden. You rule out the continuing occurrence of environmental variation and of mutations. In a sense I do, I insisted. More and more man is controlling his environment, and more he is understanding the mechanism of mutations. Before man appeared on the scene, creatures could neither foresee and guard themselves against shifts in climatic conditions, nor could they understand the increasing danger from newly developing species before the danger had become overwhelming. But now ask yourself this question. What species of organism can possibly replace us, and how is it going to accomplish the task? We can start off, said Madden, by considering the insects. I think they're doing the job already. They haven't prevented us from increasing in population about tenfold in the past 250 years. If man were ever to concentrate on the struggle with the insects, instead of spending most of his spare effort on other types of fighting, said insects would not last long. We would clean them off the planet. What about bacteria, or better still, viruses? Asked Madden. The influenza virus of 1918 did a respectable job of getting rid of a sizable percentage of us. Sure, I said, just about 1%. Even the Black Death of the 14th century only managed to kill 1/3 of the population of Europe, and that at a time when medical science was non-existent. It was allowed to run its course at will, under the most appalling conditions of medieval poverty, filth, and squalor, and still 2/3 of our very tough species managed to survive. Disease can't do it. What about man himself developing into a sort of Superman and displacing the old-timers? Suggested Thadier. Not likely, I said. The only part of the human being which is worth anything as far as being boss of the world is concerned is his nervous system. The cerebral hemispheres of the brain in particular. They are the most specialized part of his organism, and therefore a dead end. If there is anything the course of evolution demonstrates, It is that once a certain degree of specialization sets in, flexibility is lost. Further development can proceed only in greater specialization. "Isn't that exactly what's wanted?" said Thedor. "Maybe it is, but as Madden pointed out, specializations have a way of reaching a point of diminishing returns. It's the size of the human head at birth that makes the process difficult and painful. It's the complexity of the human mentality that makes mental and emotional maturity lag so far behind sexual maturity in man, with its consequent harvest of troubles. It's the delicacy of mental equipment that makes most or all of the race neurotic. How much further can we go without complete disaster?" "The development," said Madden, "might be in greater stability or quicker maturity, rather than higher brain power." "Maybe, but there are no signs of it. Cro-Magnon man existed 10,000 years ago, and there are indications that modern man is his inferior, if anything, in brain power, and in physique, too." 10,000 years, said Trotter, isn't much evolutionarily speaking. Besides, there is always the possibility of other species of animals developing intelligence or something better. And don't say there couldn't be anything better. We'd never let them. That's the point. It would take hundreds of thousands of years for, let us say, apes or insects to become intelligent, and we'd wipe them out or else use them as slaves. "All right," said Thedor. "What about obscure biochemical deficiencies, such as you insisted on in the case of the dinosaurs? Take vitamin C, for instance. The only organisms that can't make their own are guinea pigs and primates, including man. Suppose this trend continues and we become impossibly dependent on too many essential food factors. Or what if the apparent increase in the susceptibility of man to cancer continues? Then what will happen?" "That's no problem," I said. "It's the essence of the new situation that we are producing all known food factors artificially, and may eventually have a completely synthetic diet. And there's no reason to think we won't learn how to prevent or cure cancer some day." Trotter got up. He had finished his coffee, but was still nursing his cup. "All right, then. You say we've hit a dead end. But what if all this has been taken into the original account? The Creator was prepared to spend 300 million years letting the dinosaurs develop something or other that would eventually result in mankind, or so you say. Why can't he have figured out a way in which man could use his intelligence and his control of the environment to prepare the next stage of the game? That might be a very tricky part of the pool game." That stopped me. "How do you mean?" Trotter smiled at me. "I was just thinking that it might not be entirely coincidence, and that a new race may be coming and an old one going, entirely through the efforts of this cerebral mechanism." He tapped his temple. "In what way?" "Stop me if I'm wrong, but aren't the scientists of nucleonics and cybernetics reaching simultaneous peaks? Aren't we inventing hydrogen bombs and thinking machines at the same time? Is that coincidence, or part of the divine purpose?" That was about all for that lunch hour. It had begun as logic chopping just to kill time, but since then I've been wondering. This has been The Darwinian Pool Table by Isaac Asimov. I'm John W. Michaels. Production copyright 2014. By audiobooks by Mike Vendetti.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.
Day of the Hunters, Isaac Asimov. Why did the dinosaurs disappear at the end of the Mesozoic era? Was it a rapid temperature drop due to dust from a giant asteroid strike, or volcanic activity, egg-sucking mammals, or perhaps something else? Many theories exist, but no one knows for certain. In the first of 3 stories to touch upon this theme, Isaac Asimov suggests that the reason may have been that dinosaurs were much more human than we supposed. And while his solution may seem far-fetched, the supporting logic of selective fossilization, that is, not all things are equally likely to become fossils, is quite valid. Indeed, some flowering plants such as magnolia and breadfruit, which appear as early as Cretaceous fossils, are believed to have developed during the Jurassic in upland environments from which no fossils have been preserved. It began the same night it ended. It wasn't much. It just bothered me. It still bothers me. You see, Joe Block, Ray Manning, and I were squatting around our favorite table in the corner bar with an evening on our hands and a mess of chatter to throw it away with. That's the beginning. Joe Block started it by talking about the atomic bomb, and what he thought ought to be done with it, and how who would have thought it 5 years ago. And I said lots of guys thought it 5 years ago and wrote stories about it, and it was going to be tough on them trying to keep ahead of the newspapers now, which led to a general palaver on how lots of screwy things might come true, and a lot of for instances were thrown about. Ray said he heard from somebody that some big-shot scientist had sent a block of lead back in time for about 2 seconds, or 2 minutes, or 2/1000th of a second. He didn't know which. He said the scientist wasn't saying anything to anybody because he didn't think anyone would believe him. So I asked, pretty sarcastic, how he came to know about it. Ray may have lots of friends, but I have the same lot, and none of them know any big-shot scientists. But he said never mind how he heard. Take it or leave it. And then there wasn't anything to do but talk about time machines, and how supposing you went back and killed your own grandfather. Or why didn't somebody from the future come back and tell us who was going to win the next war? Or if there was going to be a next war, or if there'd be anywhere on Earth you could live after it, regardless of who wins. Ray thought just knowing the winner in the 7th race while the 6th was being run would be something. But Joe decided different. He said, the trouble with you guys is you got wars and races on the mind. Me, I got curiosity. Know what I'd do if I had a time machine? So right away we wanted to know, all ready to give him the old snicker, whatever it was. He said, if I had one, I'd go back in time a couple or 5 or 50 million years and find out what happened to the dinosaurs. Which was too bad for Joe, because Ray and I both thought there was just about no sense to that at all. Ray said who cared about a lot of dinosaurs, and I said the only thing they were good for was to make a mess of skeletons for guys who were dopey enough to wear out the floors in museums, and it was a good thing they did get out of the way to make room for human beings. Of course, Joe said that with some human beings he knew, and he gave us a hard look, we should have stuck to dinosaurs, but we pay no attention to that. You dumb squirts can laugh and make like you know something, but that's because you don't ever have any imagination, he says. Those dinosaurs were big stuff, millions of all kinds, big as houses, and dumb as houses, too, all over the place. And then all of a sudden, like that, and he snaps his fingers, there aren't any anymore. How come, we wanted to know. But he was just finishing a beer and waving at Charlie for another with a coin to prove he wanted to pay for it, and he just shrugged his shoulders. I don't know. That's what I'd find out, though. That's all. That would have finished it. I would have said something, and Ray would have made a crack, and we all would have had another beer and maybe swapped some talk about the weather and the Brooklyn Dodgers, and then said so long and never think of dinosaurs again. Only we didn't. And now I never have anything on my mind but dinosaurs, and I feel sick. Because the rummy at the next table looks up and hollers, "Hey!" We hadn't seen him. As a general rule, we don't go around looking at rummies we don't know in bars. I got plenty to do keeping track of the rummies I do know. This fellow had a bottle before him that was half empty, and a glass in his hand that was half full. He said, "Hey!" And we all looked at him. And Ray said, "Ask him what he wants, Joe." Joe was nearest. He tipped his chair backward and said, "What do you want?" The rummy said, "Did I hear you gentlemen mention dinosaurs?" He was just a little weavy, and his eyes looked like they were bleeding, and you could only tell his shirt was once white by guessing. But it must have been the way he talked. It didn't sound rummy, if you know what I mean. Anyway, Joe sort of eased up and said, "Sure, something you want to know?" He sort of smiled at us. It was a funny smile. It started at the mouth and ended just before it touched the eyes. He said, "Did you want to build a time machine and go back and find out what happened to the dinosaurs?" I could see Joe was figuring that some kind of confidence game was coming up. I was figuring the same thing. Joe said, "Why? You aiming to offer to build one for me?" The rummy showed a mess of teeth and said, "No, sir. I could, but I won't. You know why? Because I built a time machine for myself a couple of years ago and went back to the Mesozoic era and found out what happened to the dinosaurs." Later on, I looked up how to spell Mesozoic, which is why I got it right, in case you're wondering. And I found out that the Mesozoic era is when all the dinosaurs were doing whatever dinosaurs do. But of course, at the time, this is just so much double talk to me, and mostly I was thinking we had a lunatic talking to us. Joe claimed afterward that he knew about this Mesozoic thing, but he'll have to talk lots longer and louder before Ray and I believe him. But that did it just the same. We said to the rummy to come over to our table. I guess I figured we could listen to him for a while and maybe get some of the bottle, and the others must have figured the same. But he held his bottle tight in his right hand when he sat down, and that's where he kept it. Ray said, "Where'd you build a time machine?" "At Midwestern University. My daughter and I worked on it together." He sounded like a college guy at that. I said, "Where is it now, in your pocket?" He didn't blink. He never jumped at us no matter how wise we cracked. Just kept talking to himself out loud, as if the whiskey had limbered up his tongue and he didn't care if we stayed or not. He said, "I broke it up. Didn't want it. Had enough of it." We didn't believe him. We didn't believe him worth a darn. You better get that straight. It stands to reason, because if a guy invented a time machine, he could clean up millions. He could clean up all the money in the world, just knowing what would happen to the stock market and the races and elections. He wouldn't throw all that away. I don't care what reasons he had. Besides, none of us were going to believe in time travel anyway, because what if you did kill your own grandfather? Well, never mind. Joe said, "Yeah, you broke it up. Sure you did. What's your name?" But he didn't answer that one, ever. We asked him a few more times, and then we ended up calling him Professor. He finished off his glass and filled it again very slow. He didn't offer us any, and we all sucked at our beers. So I said, "Well, go ahead. What happened to the dinosaurs?" But he didn't tell us right away. He stared right at the middle of the table and talked to it. I don't know how many times Carol sent me back, just a few minutes or hours, before I made the big jump. I didn't care about the dinosaurs. I just wanted to see how far the machine would take me on the supply of power I had available. I suppose it was dangerous, but is life so wonderful? The war was on then. One more life? He sort of coddled his glass as if he was thinking about things in general. Then he seemed to skip a part in his mind and kept right on going. It was sunny, he said. Sunny and bright, dry and hard. There were no swamps, no ferns, none of the accoutrements of the Cretaceous we associate with dinosaurs. Anyway, I think that's what he said. I didn't always catch the big words, so later on I'll just stick in what I can remember. I checked all the spellings, and I must say that for all the liquor he put away, he pronounced them without stutters. That's maybe what bothered us. He sounded so familiar with everything, and it all just rolled off his tongue like nothing. He went on. It was a late age, certainly the Cretaceous. The dinosaurs were already on the way out, all except those little ones with their metal belts and their guns. I guess Joe practically dropped his nose into the beer altogether. He skidded halfway around the glass when the professor let loose that statement, sort of sad-like. Joe sounded mad. What little ones? With whose metal belts and which guns? The professor looked at him for just a second, and then let his eyes slide back to nowhere. They were little reptiles, standing 4 feet high. They stood on their hind legs, with a thick tail behind, and they had little forearms with fingers. Around their waists were strapped wide metal belts, and from these hung guns. And they weren't guns that shot pellets either. They were energy projectors. They were what? I asked. Say, when was this? Millions of years ago? That's right, he said. They were reptiles. They had scales and no eyelids, and they probably laid eggs. But they used energy guns. There were 5 of them. They were on me as soon as I got out of the machine. There must have been millions of them all over the earth. Millions. Scattered all over. They must have been the lords of creation then. I guess it was then that Ray thought he had him, because he developed that wise look in his eyes that makes you feel like conking him with an empty beer mug, because a full one would waste beer. He said, "Look, Professor, millions of them, huh? Aren't there guys who don't do anything but find old bones and mess around with them till they figure out what some dinosaur looked like? The museums are full of these here skeletons, aren't they? Well, where's there one with a metal belt on him? If there were millions, what's become of them? Where are the bones?" The professor sighed. It was a real sad sigh. Maybe he realized for the first time he was just speaking to 3 guys in overalls in a barroom. Or maybe he didn't care. He said, "You don't find many fossils. Think how many animals lived on Earth altogether. Think how many billions and trillions. And then think how few fossils we find. And these lizards were intelligent, remember that. They're not going to get caught in snowdrifts or mud or fall into lava, except by big accident. Think how few fossil men there are, even of these sub-intelligent ape-men of 1,000,000 years ago. He looked at his half-full glass and turned it round and round. He said, "What would fossils show, anyway? Metal belts rust away and leave nothing. Those little lizards were warm-blooded, I know that, but you couldn't prove it from petrified bones. What the devil? 1,000,000 years from now, could you tell what New York looks like from a human skeleton? Could you tell a human from a gorilla by the bones and figure out which one built an atomic bomb and which one ate bananas in a zoo?" "Hey," said Joe, plenty objecting. "Any simple bum can tell a gorilla skeleton from a man's. A man's got a larger brain. Any fool can tell which one was intelligent." "Really?" The professor laughed to himself, as if all this was so simple and obvious it was just a crying shame to waste time on it. "You judge everything from the type of brain human beings have managed to develop. Evolution has different ways of doing things. Birds fly one way. Bats fly another way. Life has plenty of tricks for everything. How much of your brain do you think you use?" "About a fifth. That's what the psychologists say. As far as they know, as far as anybody knows, 80% of your brain has no use at all. Everybody just works on way low gear, except maybe a few in history. Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, Archimedes, Aristotle, Gauss, Galois, Einstein." I never heard of any of them except Einstein, but I didn't let on. He mentioned a few more, but I've put in all I can remember. And then he said, "Those little reptiles had tiny brains, maybe quarter size, maybe even less, but they used it all, every bit of it. Their bones might not show it, but they were intelligent as humans, and they were boss of all Earth." And then Joe came up with something that was really good. For a while I was sure that he had the professor, and I was awfully glad he came out with it. He said, "Look, Professor, if those lizards were so damned hot, why didn't they leave something behind? Where are their cities and their buildings and all the sort of stuff we keep finding of the cavemen? Stone knives and things. Hell, if human beings got the heck off of Earth, think of the stuff we'd leave behind us. You couldn't walk a mile without falling over a city, and roads and things." But the professor just couldn't be stopped. He wasn't even shaken up. He just came right back with, "You're still judging other forms of life by human standards. We build cities and roads and airports and the rest that goes with us. But they didn't. They were built on a different plan. Their whole way of life was different from the ground up. They didn't live in cities. They didn't have our kind of art. I'm not sure what they did have because it was so alien I couldn't grasp it, except for their guns. Those would be the same. Funny, isn't it? For all I know, maybe we stumble over their relics every day and don't even know that's what they are." I was pretty sick of it by that time. You just couldn't get him. The cuter you'd be, the cuter he'd be. I said, "Look here, how do you know so much about those things? What did you do, live with them? Or did they speak English? Or maybe you speak lizard talk. Give us a few words of lizard talk." I guess I was getting mad, too. You know how it is. A guy tells you something you don't believe because it's all cockeyed, and you can't get him to admit he's lying. But the professor wasn't mad. He was just filling the glass again, very slowly. "No," he said, "I didn't talk, and they didn't talk. They just looked at me with their cold, hard, staring eyes. Snake's eyes. And I knew what they were thinking, and I could see that they knew what I was thinking. Don't ask me how it happened. It just did. Everything. I knew that they were out on a hunting expedition, and I knew they weren't going to let me go." And we stopped asking questions. We just looked at him. Then Ray said, "What happened? How did you get away?" That was easy. An animal scurried past on the hilltop. It was long, maybe 10 feet, and narrow, and ran close to the ground. The lizards got excited. I could feel the excitement in waves. It was as if they forgot about me in a single hot flash of bloodlust, and off they went. I got back in the machine, returned, and broke it up. It was the flattest sort of ending you ever heard. Joe made a noise in his throat. "Well, what happened to the dinosaurs?" "Oh, you don't see? I thought it was plain enough. It was those little intelligent lizards that did it. They were hunters, by instinct and by choice. It was their hobby in life. It wasn't for food, it was for fun." "And they just wiped out all the dinosaurs on the Earth?" All that lived at the time, anyway. All the contemporary species. Don't you think it's possible? How long did it take us to wipe out bison herds by the 100 million? What happened to the dodo in a few years? Supposing we really put our minds to it, how long would the lions and the tigers and the giraffes last? Why, by the time I saw those lizards, there wasn't any big game left. No reptile more than 15 feet, maybe. All gone. Those little demons were chasing the little scurrying ones and probably crying their hearts out for the good old days. And we all kept quiet and looked at our empty beer bottles and thought about it. All those dinosaurs, big as houses, killed by little lizards with guns. Killed for fun. Then Joe leaned over and put his hand on the professor's shoulder, easy-like, and shook it. He said, "Hey, Professor, but if that's so, what happened to the little lizards with the guns, huh? Did you ever go back to find out?" The professor looked up with the kind of look in his eyes that he'd have if he were lost. "You still don't see. It was already beginning to happen to them. I saw it in their eyes. They were running out of big game. The fun was going out of it. So what did you expect them to do? They turned to other game, the biggest and most dangerous of all, and really had fun. They hunted that game to the end." "What game?" asked Ray. He didn't get it, but Joe and I did. "Themselves," said the professor in a loud voice. "They finished off all the others and began on themselves, till not one was left." And again we stopped and thought about those dinosaurs, big as houses, all finished off by little lizards with guns. Then we thought about the little lizards and how they had to keep the guns going even when there was nothing to use them on but themselves. Joe said, "Poor, dumb lizards." "Yeah," said Ray. "Poor crackpot lizards." And then what happened really scared us, because the professor jumped up with eyes that looked as if they were trying to climb right out of their sockets and leap at us. He shouted, "You damned fools! Why do you sit there slobbering over reptiles dead 100 million years? That was the first intelligence on Earth, and that's how it ended. That's done. But we're the second intelligence, and how the devil do you think we're going to end?" He pushed the chair over and headed for the door. But then he stood there just before leaving altogether and said, "Poor, dumb humanity. Go ahead and cry about that."
This is a reissue of CB 196. This book contains up to 4 sides per cassette. Side 1, I, Robot, by Isaac Asimov. Copyright 1950 by Isaac Asimov. Narrated by Bob Askey. This book contains 218 pages on 5 sides. To you, a robot is a robot. Gears and metal, electricity and positrons, mind and iron, human-made, if necessary, human-destroyed. But you haven't worked with them, so you don't know them. They're a cleaner, better breed than we are. Dr. Susan Calvin, 2057 AD. In a brilliant, chilling series of 9 related short stories, the author chronicles robot development from its crude mid-20th century beginnings to a state of such perfection that 100 years later, robots are running man's world for his own good. Dr. Asimov has endowed his mechanical creations with disarmingly human personalities, from Robbie, the beloved mute nursemaid of an 8-year-old girl, to Stephen Byerly, who was elected first world coordinator. Isaac Asimov. Over the past 20 years, the name Isaac Asimov has become increasingly familiar to both scientists and science fiction readers. A highly skilled and prolific writer, he has an impressive record of more than 50 successful fiction and non-fiction books, including most recently Life and Energy and Fact and Fancy. Born in Russia, Dr. Asimov was educated at Columbia University, Ph.D. in 1948, and he became assistant professor of biochemistry at Boston University School of Medicine. In 1958, he left this position to devote his full time to writing. He lives in West Newton, Massachusetts. I, Robot, by Isaac Asimov. To John W. Campbell, Jr., who godfathered the robots. Contents. Introduction. Side 1. 1. Robbie. Side 1. 2. Runaround. Side 1. 3. Reason. Side 2. 4. Catch that rabbit. Side 2. 5. Liar. Side 3. 6. Little Lost Robot. Side 3. 7. Escape. Side 4. 8. Evidence. Side 4. 9. The Inevitable Conflict. Side 5. The 3 laws of robotics. 1. A robot may not injure a human being, or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Handbook of Robotics, 56th edition, 2058 AD. I, Robot. Introduction. I looked at my notes and I didn't like them. I'd spent 3 days at U.S. Robots and might as well have spent them at home with the Encyclopedia Tellurica. Susan Calvin had been born in the year 1982, they said, which made her 75 now. Everyone knew that. Appropriately enough, U.S. Robot and Mechanical Men Incorporated was 75 also, since it had been in the year of Dr. Calvin's birth that Lawrence Robertson had first taken out incorporation papers for what eventually became the strangest industrial giant in man's history. Well, everyone knew that, too. At the age of 20, Susan Calvin had been part of the particular psychomath seminar at which Dr. Alfred Lanning of U.S. Robots had demonstrated the first mobile robot to be equipped with a voice. It was a large, clumsy, unbeautiful robot, smelling of machine oil and destined for the projected mines on Mercury, but it could speak and make sense. Susan said nothing at that seminar, took no part in the hectic discussion period that followed. She was a frosty girl, plain and colorless, who protected herself against a world she disliked by a mask-like expression and a hypertrophy of intellect. But as she watched and listened, she felt the stirrings of a cold enthusiasm. She obtained her bachelor's degree at Columbia in 2003 and began graduate work in cybernetics. All that had been done in the mid-20th century on calculating machines had been upset by Robertson and his positronic brain paths. The miles of relays and photocells had given way to the spongy globe of platinum meridium, about the size of a human brain. She learned to calculate the parameters necessary to fix the possible variables within the positronic brain, to construct brains on paper so that the responses to given stimuli could be accurately predicted. In 2008, she obtained her Ph.D. and joined United States Robots as a robo-psychologist, becoming the first great practitioner of a new science. Lawrence Robertson was still president of the corporation. Alfred Lanning had become director of research. For 50 years, she watched the direction of human progress change and leap ahead. Now she was retiring, as much as she ever could. At least she was allowing someone else's name to be inset upon the door of her old office. That essentially was what I had. I had a long list of her published papers, of the patents in her name. I had the chronological details of her promotions. In short, I had her professional vita in full detail. But that wasn't what I wanted. I needed more than that for my feature articles for Interplanetary Press. Much more. I told her so. Dr. Calvin, I said, as lushly as possible, in the mind of the public, you and U.S. Robots are identical. Your retirement will end an era, and... You want the human interest angle? She didn't smile at me. I don't think she ever smiles, but her eyes were sharp, though not angry. I felt her glance slide through me and out my occiput, and knew that I was uncommonly transparent to her, that everybody was. But I said, that's right. Human interest out of robots? A contradiction. No, Doctor, out of you. Well, I've been called a robot myself. Surely they've told you I'm not human. They had, but there was no point in saying so. She got up from her chair. She wasn't tall, and she looked frail. I followed her to the window, and we looked out. The offices and factories of U.S. Robots were a small city, spaced and planned. It was flattened out like an aerial photograph. When I first came here, she said, I had a little room in a building right about there where the firehouse is now. She pointed. It was torn down before you were born. I shared the room with 3 others. I had half a desk. We built our robots all in one building. Output, 3 a week. Now look at us. 50 years, I hackneyed, is a long time. Not when you're looking back at them, she said. You wonder how they vanished so quickly. She went back to her desk and sat down. She didn't need expression on her face to look sad somehow. How old are you? She wanted to know. 32, I said. Then you don't remember a world without robots. There was a time when humanity faced the universe alone and without a friend. Now he has creatures to help him, stronger creatures than himself, more faithful, more useful, and absolutely devoted to him. Mankind is no longer alone. Have you ever thought of it that way? I'm afraid I haven't. May I quote you? You may. To you, a robot is a robot. Gears and metal, electricity and positrons, mind and iron, human-made, if necessary, human-destroyed. But you haven't worked with them, so you don't know them. They're a cleaner, better breed than we are. I tried to nudge her gently with words. We'd like to hear some of the things you could tell us, get your views on robots. The interplanetary press reaches the entire solar system. Potential audience is 3 billion, Dr. Calvin. They ought to know what you could tell them on robots. It wasn't necessary to nudge. She didn't hear me, but she was moving in the right direction. They might have known that from the start. We sold robots for Earth use then. Before my time it was, even. Of course, that was when robots could not talk. Afterward, they became more human, and opposition began. The labor unions, of course, naturally opposed robot competition for human jobs, and various segments of religious opinion had their superstitious objections. It was all quite ridiculous and quite useless, and yet there it was. I was taking it down verbatim on my pocket recorder, trying not to show the knuckle motions of my hand. If you practice a bit, you can get to the point where you can record accurately without taking the little gadget out of your pocket. Take the case of Robbie, she said. I never knew him. He was dismantled the year before I joined the company, hopelessly out of date. But I saw the little girl in the museum. She stopped, but I didn't say anything. I let her eyes mist up, and her mind travel back. She had lots of time to cover. I heard about it later, and when they called us blasphemers and demon creators, I always thought of him. Robbie was a non-vocal robot. He couldn't speak. He was made and sold in 1996. Those were the days before extreme specialization, so he was sold as a nursemaid. As a what? As a nursemaid. 1. Robbie. 98, 99, 100. Gloria withdrew her chubby little forearm from before her eyes and stood for a moment, wrinkling her nose and blinking in the sunlight. Then, trying to watch in all directions at once, she withdrew a few cautious steps from the tree against which she had been leaning. She craned her neck to investigate the possibilities of a clump of bushes to the right, and then withdrew farther to obtain a better angle for viewing its dark recesses. The quiet was profound, except for the incessant buzzing of insects and the occasional chirp of some hardy bird braving the midday sun. Gloria pouted. I bet he went inside the house, and I've told him 1,000,000 times that that's not fair. With tiny lips pressed together tightly and a severe frown crinkling her forehead, she moved determinedly toward the 2-story building up past the driveway. Too late, she heard the rustling sound behind her, followed by the distinctive and rhythmic plump-plump of Robbie's metal feet. She whirled about to see her triumphing companion emerge from hiding and make for the home tree at full speed. Gloria shrieked in dismay. Wait, Robbie, that wasn't fair, Robbie. You promised you wouldn't run until I found you. Her little feet could make no headway at all against Robbie's giant strides. Then, within 10 feet of the goal, Robbie's pace slowed suddenly to the merest of crawls, and Gloria, with one final burst of wild speed, dashed pantingly past him to touch the welcome bark of home tree first. Gleefully, she turned on the faithful Robbie, and with the basest of ingratitude rewarded him for his sacrifice by taunting him cruelly for a lack of running ability. Robbie can't run, she shouted at the top of her 8-year-old voice. I can beat him any day. I can beat him any day. She chanted the words in a shrill rhythm. Robbie didn't answer, of course, not in words. He pantomimed running, instead, inching away until Gloria found herself running after him as he dodged her narrowly, forcing her to veer in helpless circles, little arms outstretched and fanning at the air. Robbie, she squealed, stand still. And the laughter was forced out of her in breathless jerks, until he turned suddenly and caught her up, whirling her around, so that for her the world fell away for a moment with a blue emptiness beneath. and green trees stretching hungrily downward toward the void. Then she was down in the grass again, leaning against Robbie's leg, and still holding a hard metal finger. After a while her breath returned. She pushed uselessly at her disheveled hair in vague imitation of one of her mother's gestures, and twisted to see if her dress were torn. She slapped her hand against Robbie's torso. "Bad boy, I'll spank you." And Robbie cowered, holding his hands over his face so that she had to add, "No, I won't, Robbie. I won't spank you. But anyway, it's my turn to hide now because you've got longer legs and you promised not to run till I found you." Robbie nodded his head, a small parallelepiped with rounded edges and corners attached to a similar but much larger parallelepiped that served as torso by means of a short, flexible stalk, and obediently faced the tree. A thin metal film descended over his glowing eyes, and from within his body came a steady, resonant ticking. "Don't peek now, and don't skip any numbers," warned Gloria, and scurried for cover. With unvarying regularity, seconds were ticked off, and at the 100th, up went the eyelids, and the glowing red of Robbie's eyes swept the prospect. They rested for a moment on a bit of colorful gingham that protruded from behind a boulder. He advanced a few steps and convinced himself that it was Gloria who squatted behind it. Slowly, remaining always between Gloria and Hometree, he advanced on the hiding place, and when Gloria was plainly in sight and could no longer even theorize to herself that she was not seen, he extended one arm toward her, slapping the other against his leg so that it rang again. Gloria emerged sulkily. "You peeked," she exclaimed with gross unfairness. "Besides, I'm tired of playing hide-and-seek. I want to ride." But Robbie was hurt at the unjust accusation, so he seated himself carefully and shook his head ponderously from side to side. Gloria changed her tone to one of gentle coaxing immediately. "Come on, Robbie. I didn't mean it about the peeking. Give me a ride." Robbie was not to be won over so easily, though. He gazed stubbornly at the sky and shook his head even more emphatically. "Please, Robbie, please give me a ride." She encircled his neck with rosy arms and hugged tightly. Then, changing moods in a moment, she moved away. "If you don't, I'm going to cry." And her face twisted appallingly in preparation. Hard-hearted Robbie paid scant attention to this dreadful possibility and shook his head a third time. Gloria found it necessary to play her trump card. "If you don't," she exclaimed warmly, "I won't tell you any more stories, that's all. Not one." Robbie gave in immediately and unconditionally before this ultimatum, nodding his head vigorously until the metal of his neck hummed. Carefully, he raised the little girl and placed her on his broad, flat shoulders. Gloria's threatened tears vanished immediately, and she crowed with delight. Robbie's metal skin, kept at a constant temperature of 70 by the high-resistance coils within, felt nice and comfortable, while the beautifully loud sound her heels made as they bumped rhythmically against his chest was enchanting. "You're an air coaster, Robbie. You're a big silver air coaster. Hold out your arms straight. You got to, Robbie, if you're going to be an air coaster." The logic was irrefutable. Robbie's arms were wings catching the air currents, and he was a silver coaster. Gloria twisted the robot's head and leaned to the right. He banked sharply. Gloria equipped the coaster with a motor that went brrr, and then with weapons that went powie and shish. Pirates were giving chase, and the ship's blasters were coming into play. The pirates dropped in a steady rain. "Got another one. 2 more," she cried. Then, "Faster, men," Gloria said pompously. "We're running out of ammunition." She aimed over her shoulder with undaunted courage, and Robbie was a blunt-nosed spaceship zooming through the void at maximum acceleration. Clear across the field he sped, to the patch of tall grass on the other side, where he stopped with a suddenness that evoked a shriek from his flushed rider, and then tumbled her onto the soft green carpet. Gloria gasped and panted, and gave voice to intermittent whispered exclamations of, "That was nice." Robbie waited until she had caught her breath, and then pulled gently at a lock of hair. "You want something?" said Gloria, eyes wide in an apparently artless complexity that fooled her huge nursemaid not at all. He pulled the curl harder. "Oh, I know. You want a story." Robbie nodded rapidly. "Which one?" Robbie made a semicircle in the air with one finger. The little girl protested. "Again? I've told you Cinderella 1,000,000 times. Aren't you tired of it? It's for babies." Another semicircle. "Oh, well," Gloria composed herself, ran over the details of the tale in her mind, together with her own elaborations, of which she had several, and began. "Are you ready? Well, Once upon a time, there was a beautiful little girl whose name was Ella, and she had a terribly cruel stepmother and two very ugly and very cruel stepsisters, and Gloria was reaching the very climax of the tale. Midnight was striking, and everything was changing back to the shabby original's lickety-split, while Robbie listened tensely with burning eyes, when the interruption came. "Gloria!" It was the high-pitched sound of a woman who has been calling not once but several times, and had the nervous tone of one in whom anxiety was beginning to overcome impatience. "Mama's calling me," said Gloria, not quite happily. "You'd better carry me back to the house, Robbie." Robbie obeyed with alacrity, for somehow there was that in him which judged it best to obey Mrs. Weston without as much as a scrap of hesitation. Gloria's father was rarely home in the daytime, except on Sunday, today for instance, and when he was, he proved a genial and understanding person. Gloria's mother, however, was a source of uneasiness to Robbie, and there was always the impulse to sneak away from her sight. Mrs. Weston caught sight of them the minute they rose above the masking tufts of long grass and retired inside the house to wait. "I've shouted myself hoarse, Gloria," she said severely. "Where were you?" "I was with Robbie," quavered Gloria. "I was telling him Cinderella, and I forgot it was dinner time." "Well, it's a pity Robbie forgot, too." Then, as if that reminded her of the robot's presence, she whirled upon him. "You may go, Robbie. She doesn't need you now." Then brutally, "And don't come back till I call you." Robbie turned to go, but hesitated as Gloria cried out in his defense, "Wait, Mama, you got to let him stay. I didn't finish Cinderella for him. I said I would tell him Cinderella, and I'm not finished." "Gloria!" "Honest and truly, Mama, he'll stay so quiet you won't even know he's here. He can sit on the chair in the corner, and he won't say a word. I mean, he won't do anything. Will you, Robbie?" Robbie, appealed to, nodded his massive head up and down once. "Gloria, if you don't stop this at once, you shan't see Robbie for a whole week." The girl's eyes fell. "All right. But Cinderella is his favorite story, and I didn't finish it. And he likes it so much." The robot left with a disconsolate step, and Gloria choked back a sob. George Weston was comfortable. It was a habit of his to be comfortable on Sunday afternoons. A good hearty dinner below the hatches, a nice, soft, dilapidated couch on which to sprawl, a copy of the Times, slippered feet and shirtless chest. How could anyone help but be comfortable? He wasn't pleased, therefore, when his wife walked in. After 10 years of married life, he still was so unutterably foolish as to love her, and there was no question that he was always glad to see her. Still, Sunday afternoons just after dinner were sacred to him, and his idea of solid comfort was to be left in utter solitude for 2 or 3 hours. Consequently, he fixed his eye firmly upon the latest reports of the Lefebvre-Yoshida expedition to Mars. This one was to take off from Lunar Base and might actually succeed, and pretended she wasn't there. Mrs. Weston waited patiently for 2 minutes, then impatiently for 2 more, and finally broke the silence. "George!" "Humph?" "George, I say, will you put down that paper and look at me?" The paper rustled to the floor, and Weston turned a weary face toward his wife. "What is it, dear?" "You know what it is, George. It's Gloria and that terrible machine." "What terrible machine?" "Now, don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. It's that robot Gloria calls Robbie. He doesn't leave her for a moment." "Well, why should he? He's not supposed to, and he certainly isn't a terrible machine. He's the best darn robot money can buy, and I'm damn sure he's set me back half a year's income. He's worth it, though. Darn sight cleverer than half my office staff." He made a move to pick up the paper again, but his wife was quicker and snatched it away. "You listen to me, George. I won't have my daughter entrusted to a machine, and I don't care how clever it is. It has no soul, and no one knows what it may be thinking. A child just isn't made to be guarded by a thing of metal." Weston frowned. "When did you decide this? He's been with Gloria 2 years now, and I haven't seen you worry till now." "It was different at first. It was a novelty. It took a load off me, and it was a fashionable thing to do. But now, I don't know, the neighbors—" "Well, what have the neighbors to do with it? Now, look. A robot is infinitely more to be trusted than a human nursemaid. Robbie was constructed for only one purpose, really, to be the companion of a little child. His entire mentality has been created for the purpose. He just can't help being faithful and loving and kind. He's a machine, made so. That's more than you can say for humans." "But something might go wrong. Some Mrs. Weston was a bit hazy about the insides of a robot, some little jigger will come loose and the awful thing will go berserk and she couldn't bring herself to complete the quite obvious thought. Nonsense, Weston denied with an involuntary nervous shiver. That's completely ridiculous. We had a long discussion at the time we bought Robbie about the first law of robotics. You know that it is impossible for a robot to harm a human being, that long before enough can go wrong to alter that first law, a robot would be completely inoperable. It's a mathematical impossibility. Besides, I have an engineer from U.S. Robots here twice a year to give the poor gadget a complete overhaul. Why, there's no more chance of anything at all going wrong with Robbie than there is of you or I suddenly going loony. Considerably less, in fact. Besides, how are you going to take him away from Gloria? He made another futile stab at the paper, and his wife tossed it angrily into the next room. That's just it, George. She won't play with anyone else. There are dozens of little boys and girls that she should make friends with, but she won't. She won't go near them unless I make her. That's no way for a little girl to grow up. You want her to be normal, don't you? You want her to be able to take her part in society. You're jumping at shadows, Grace. Pretend Robbie's a dog. I've seen hundreds of children who would rather have their dog than their father. A dog is different, George. We must get rid of that horrible thing. You can sell it back to the company. I've asked and you can. You've asked? Now look here, Grace. Let's not go off the deep end. We're keeping the robot until Gloria is older, and I don't want the subject brought up again. And with that, he walked out of the room in a huff. Mrs. Weston met her husband at the door 2 evenings later. You'll have to listen to this, George. There's bad feeling in the village. About what? Asked Weston. He stepped into the washroom and drowned out any possible answer with a splash of water. Mrs. Weston waited. She said, About Robbie. Weston stepped out, towel in hand, face red and angry. What are you talking about? Oh, it's been building up and building up. I've tried to close my eyes to it, but I'm not going to anymore. Most of the villagers consider Robbie dangerous. Children aren't allowed to go near our place in the evenings. We trust our child with the thing. Well, people aren't reasonable about these things. Then to hell with them. Saying that doesn't solve the problem. I've got to do my shopping down there. I've got to meet them every day. And it's even worse in the city these days when it comes to robots. New York has just passed an ordinance keeping all robots off the street between sunset and sunrise. All right, but they can't stop us from keeping a robot in our home. Grace, this is one of your campaigns. I recognize it. But it's no use. The answer is still no. We're keeping Robbie. And yet he loved his wife. And what was worse, his wife knew it. George Weston, after all, was only a man, poor thing, and his wife made full use of every device which a clumsier and more scrupulous sex has learned, with reason and futility, to fear. 10 times in the ensuing week he cried, Robbie stays, and that's final. And each time it was weaker, and accompanied by a louder and more agonized groan. Came the day at last when Weston approached his daughter guiltily and suggested a beautiful Visivox show in the village. Gloria clapped her hands happily. Can Robbie go? No, dear, he said, and winced at the sound of his voice. They won't allow robots at the Visivox, but you can tell him all about it when you get home. He stumbled all over the last few words and looked away. Gloria came back from town bubbling over with enthusiasm, for the Visivox had been a gorgeous spectacle indeed. She waited for her father to maneuver the jet car into the sunken garage. Wait till I tell Robbie, Daddy. He would have liked it like anything, especially when Francis Fran was backing away so quietly and backed right into one of the leopard men and had to run. She laughed again. Daddy, are there really leopard men on the moon? Probably not, said Weston absently. It's just funny make-believe. He couldn't take much longer with the car. He'd have to face it. Gloria ran across the lawn. Robbie! Robbie! Then she stopped suddenly at the sight of a beautiful collie, which regarded her out of serious brown eyes as it wagged its tail on the porch. Oh, what a nice dog! Gloria climbed the steps, approached cautiously, and patted it. Is it for me, Daddy? Her mother had joined them. Yes, it is, Gloria. Isn't it nice, soft and furry? It's very gentle. It likes little girls. Can he play games? Surely, he can do any number of tricks. Would you like to see some? Right away. I want Robbie to see him, too. Robbie! She stopped uncertainly and frowned. I'll bet he's just staying in his room because he's mad at me for not taking him to the Visivox. You'll have to explain to him, Daddy. He might not believe me, but he knows if you say it, it's so. Weston's lips grew tighter. He looked toward his wife, but could not catch her eye. Gloria turned precipitously and ran down the basement steps, shouting as she went, "Robbie, come and see what Daddy and Mama brought me. They brought me a dog, Robbie." In a minute she had returned, a frightened little girl. "Mama, Robbie isn't in his room. Where is he?" There was no answer, and George Weston coughed and was suddenly extremely interested in a namelessly drifting cloud. Gloria's voice quavered on the verge of tears. "Where's Robbie, Mama?" Mrs. Weston sat down and drew her daughter gently to her. "Don't feel bad, Gloria. Robbie has gone away, I think." "Gone away? Where? Where's he gone away, Mama?" "No one knows, darling. He just walked away. We've looked and we've looked and we've looked for him, but we can't find him." "You mean he'll never come back again?" Her eyes were round with horror. "We may find him soon. We'll keep looking for him. And meanwhile, you can play with your nice new doggie. Look at him. His name is Lightning, and he can—" But Gloria's eyelids had overflown. "I don't want the nasty dog. I want Robbie. I want you to find me Robbie." Her feelings became too deep for words, and she spluttered into a shrill wail. Mrs. Weston glanced at her husband for help, but he merely shuffled his feet morosely and did not withdraw his ardent stare from the heavens, so she bent to the task of consolation. "Why do you cry, Gloria? Robbie was only a machine, just a nasty old machine. He wasn't alive at all." "He was not no machine," screamed Gloria, fiercely and ungrammatically. "He was a person, just like you and me, and he was my friend. I want him back. Oh, Mama, I want him back." Her mother groaned in defeat and left Gloria to her sorrow. "Let her have her cry out," she told her husband. "Childish griefs are never lasting. In a few days she'll forget that awful robot ever existed." But time proved Mrs. Weston a bit too optimistic. To be sure, Gloria ceased crying, but she ceased smiling, too, and the passing days found her ever more silent and shadowy. Gradually, her attitude of passive unhappiness wore Mrs. Weston down, and all that kept her from yielding was the impossibility of admitting defeat to her husband. Then one evening she flounced into the living room, sat down, folded her arms, and looked boiling mad. Her husband stretched his neck in order to see her over his newspaper. "What now, Grace?" "It's that child, George. I've had to send back the dog today. Gloria positively couldn't stand the sight of him, she said. She's driving me into a nervous breakdown." Weston laid down the paper, and a hopeful gleam entered his eye. Maybe we ought to get Robbie back. It might be done, you know. I can get in touch with—" "No," she replied grimly. "I won't hear of it. We're not giving up that easily. My child shall not be brought up by a robot if it takes years to break her of it." Weston picked up his paper again with a disappointed air. "A year of this will have me prematurely gray." "You're a big help, George," was the frigid answer. "What Gloria needs is a change of environment. Of course she can't forget Robbie here. How can she, when every tree and rock reminds her of him? It is really the silliest situation I've ever heard of. Imagine a child pining away for the loss of a robot." "Well, stick to the point. What's the change in environment you're planning?" "We're going to take her to New York." "The city? In August? Say, do you know what New York is like in August? It's unbearable." "Millions do bear it." "They don't have a place like this to go to. If they didn't have to stay in New York, they wouldn't." "Well, we have to. I say we're leaving now, or as soon as we can make the arrangements. In the city, Gloria will find sufficient interests and sufficient friends to perk her up and make her forget that machine." "Oh, Lord," groaned the lesser half. "Those frying pavements." "We have to," was the unshaken response. "Gloria has lost 5 pounds in the last month, and my little girl's health is more important to me than your comfort." "It's a pity you didn't think of your little girl's health before you deprived her of her pet robot," he muttered, but to himself. Gloria displayed immediate signs of improvement when told of the impending trip to the city. She spoke little of it, but when she did, it was always with lively anticipation. Again she began to smile, and to eat with something of her former appetite. Mrs. Weston hugged herself for joy and lost no opportunity to triumph over her still skeptical husband. "You see, George, she helps with the packing like a little angel, and chatters away as if she hadn't a care in the world. It's just as I told you. All we need do is substitute other interests." "Humph," was the skeptical response. "I hope so." Preliminaries were gone through quickly. Arrangements were made for the preparation of their city home, and a couple were engaged as housekeepers for the country home. When the day of the trip finally did come, Gloria was all but her old self again, and no mention of Robbie passed her lips at all. In high good humor, the family took a taxi gyro to the airport. Weston would have preferred using his own private gyro, but it was only a two-seater with no room for baggage, and entered the waiting liner. "Come, Gloria," called Mrs. Weston. "I've saved you a seat near the window so you can watch the scenery." Gloria trotted down the aisle cheerily, flattened her nose into a white oval against the thick, clear glass, and watched with an intentness that increased as the sudden coughing of the motor drifted backward into the interior. She was too young to be frightened when the ground dropped away as if let through a trapdoor, and she herself suddenly became twice her usual weight, but not too young to be mightily interested. It wasn't until the ground had changed into a tiny patchwork quilt that she withdrew her nose and faced her mother again. "Will we soon be in the city, Mama?" she asked, rubbing her chilled nose and watching with interest as the patch of moisture, which her breath had formed on the pane, shrank slowly and vanished. "In about half an hour, dear." Then, with just the faintest trace of anxiety, "Aren't you glad we're going? Don't you think you'll be very happy in the city with all the buildings and people and things to see? We'll go to the Visivox every day and see shows and go to the circus and the beach and—" "Yes, Mama," was Gloria's unenthusiastic rejoinder. The liner passed over a bank of clouds at the moment, and Gloria was instantly absorbed in the unusual spectacle of clouds underneath one. Then they were over clear sky again, and she turned to her mother with a sudden mysterious air of secret knowledge. "I know why we're going to the city, Mama." "Do you?" Mrs. Weston was puzzled. "Why, dear?" "You didn't tell me because you wanted it to be a surprise, but I know." For a moment, she was lost in admiration at her own acute penetration, and then she laughed gaily. "We're going to New York so we can find Robbie, aren't we, with detectives?" The statement caught George Weston in the middle of a drink of water, with disastrous results. There was a sort of strangled gasp, a geyser of water, and then a bout of choking coughs. When all was over, he stood there, a red-faced, water-drenched, and very, very annoyed person. Mrs. Weston maintained her composure, but when Gloria repeated her question in a more anxious tone of voice, she found her temper rather bent. "Maybe," she retorted tartly. "Now sit and be still, for heaven's sake." New York City, 1998 A.D., was a paradise for the sightseer more than ever in its history. Gloria's parents realized this and made the most of it. On direct orders from his wife, George Weston arranged to have his business take care of itself for a month or so, in order to be free to spend the time in what he termed dissipating Gloria to the verge of ruin. Like everything else Weston did, this was gone about in an efficient, thorough, and businesslike way. Before the month had passed, nothing that could be done had not been done. She was taken to the top of the half-mile-tall Roosevelt Building to gaze down in awe upon the jagged panorama of rooftops that blended far off in the fields of Long Island and the flatlands of New Jersey. They visited the zoos, where Gloria stared in delicious fright at a real live lion, rather disappointed that the keepers fed him raw steaks instead of human beings, as she had expected, and asked insistently and peremptorily to see the whale. The various museums came in for their share of attention, together with the parks and the beaches and the aquarium. She was taken halfway up the Hudson in an excursion steamer fitted out in the archaism of the mad 20s. She traveled into the stratosphere on an exhibition trip, where the sky turned deep purple, and the stars came out, and the misty earth below looked like a huge concave bowl. Down under the waters of the Long Island Sound she was taken in a glass-walled sub-sea vessel, where in a green and wavering world, quaint and curious sea things ogled her and wiggled suddenly away. On a more prosaic level, Mrs. Weston took her to the department stores, where she could revel in another type of fairyland. In fact, when the month had nearly sped, the Westons were convinced that everything conceivable had been done to take Gloria's mind once and for all off the departed Robbie. But they were not quite sure they had succeeded. The fact remained that wherever Gloria went, she displayed the most absorbed and concentrated interest in such robots as happened to be present. No matter how exciting the spectacle before her, nor how novel to her girlish eyes, she turned away instantly if the corner of her eye caught a glimpse of metallic movement. Mrs. Weston went out of her way to keep Gloria away from all robots, and the matter was finally climaxed in the episode at the Museum of Science and Industry. The museum had announced a special children's program in which exhibits of scientific witchery scaled down to the child's mind were to be shown. The Westons, of course, placed it upon their list of absolutely. It was while the Westons were standing totally absorbed in the exploits of a powerful electromagnet that Mrs. Weston suddenly became aware of the fact that Gloria was no longer with her. Initial panic gave way to calm decision, and, Enlisting the aid of 3 attendants, a careful search was begun. Gloria, of course, was not one to wander aimlessly, however. For her age, she was an unusually determined and purposeful girl, quite full of the maternal genes in that respect. She had seen a huge sign on the 3rd floor which had said, "This way to the talking robot." Having spelled it out to herself, and having noticed that her parents did not seem to wish to move in the proper direction, she did the obvious thing. Waiting for an opportune moment of parental distraction, she calmly disengaged herself and followed the sign. The talking robot was a tour de force, a thoroughly impractical device, possessing publicity value only. Once an hour, an escorted group stood before it and asked questions of the robot engineer in charge in careful whispers. Those the engineer decided were suitable for the robot's circuits were transmitted to the talking robot. It was rather dull. It may be nice to know that the square of 14 is 196, that the temperature at the moment is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air pressure 30.02 inches of mercury, that the atomic weight of sodium is 23. But one doesn't really need a robot for that. One especially does not need an unwieldy, totally immobile mass of wires and coils spreading over 25 square yards. Few people bothered to return for a second helping, but one girl in her middle teens sat quietly on a bench waiting for a third. She was the only one in the room when Gloria entered. Gloria did not look at her. To her at the moment, another human being was but an inconsiderable item. She saved her attention for this large thing with the wheels. For a moment she hesitated in dismay. It didn't look like any robot she had ever seen. Cautiously and doubtfully she raised her treble voice. "Please, Mr. Robot, sir, are you the talking robot, sir?" She wasn't sure, but it seemed to her that a robot that actually talked was worth a great deal of politeness. The girl in her mid-teens allowed a look of intense concentration to cross her thin, plain face. She whipped out a small notebook and began writing in rapid pothooks. There was an oily whir of gears, and a mechanically timbered voice boomed out in words that lacked accent and intonation. "I am the robot that talks." Gloria stared at it ruefully. It did talk, but the sound came from inside somewheres. There was no face to talk to. She said, "Can you help me, Mr. Robot, sir?" The talking robot was designed to answer questions, and only such questions as it could answer had ever been put to it. It was quite confident of its ability, therefore. "I can help you." "Thank you, Mr. Robot, sir. Have you seen Robbie?" "Who is Robbie?" "He's a robot, Mr. Robot, sir." She stretched to tiptoes. "He's about so high, Mr. Robot, sir, only higher, and he's very nice. He's got a head, you know. I mean, you haven't, but he has, Mr. Robot, sir." The talking robot had been left behind. Robot?" "Yes, Mr. Robot, sir. A robot just like you, except he can't talk, of course, and looks like a real person." "A robot like me?" "Yes, Mr. Robot, sir." To which the talking robot's only response was an erratic splutter and an occasional incoherent sound. The radical generalization offered it, i.e. its existence, not as a particular object, but as a member of a general group, was too much for it. Loyally, it tried to encompass the concept, and half a dozen coils burnt out. Little warning signals were buzzing. The girl in her mid-teens left at that point. She had enough for her Physics 1 paper on practical aspects of robotics. This paper was Susan Calvin's first of many on the subject. Gloria stood waiting with carefully concealed impatience for the machine's answer when she heard the cry behind her of, "There she is," and recognized that cry as her mother's. "What are you doing here, you bad girl?" cried Mrs. Weston, anxiety dissolving at once into anger. "Do you know you frightened your mama and daddy almost to death? Why did you run away?" The robot engineer had also dashed in, tearing his hair, and demanding who of the gathering crowd had tampered with the machine. "Can't anybody read signs?" he yelled. "You're not allowed in here without an attendant." Gloria raised her grieved voice over the din. "I only came to see the talking robot, Mama. I thought he might know where Robbie was, because they're both robots." And then, as the thought of Robbie was suddenly brought forcefully home to her, she burst into a sudden storm of tears. "And I got to find Robbie, Mama. I got to." Mrs. Weston strangled a cry and said, "Oh, good heavens. Come home, George. This is more than I can stand." That evening, George Weston left for several hours, and the next morning he approached his wife with something that looked suspiciously like smug complacence. "I've got an idea, Grace." About what? Was the gloomy, uninterested query. About Gloria. You're not going to suggest buying back that robot? No, of course not. Then go ahead. I might as well listen to you. Nothing I've done seems to have done any good. All right, here's what I've been thinking. The whole trouble with Gloria is that she thinks of Robbie as a person and not as a machine. Naturally, she can't forget him. Now, if we managed to convince her that Robbie was nothing more than a mess of steel and copper in the form of sheets and wires with electricity its juice of life, how long would her longings last? It's the psychological attack, if you see my point. How do you plan to do it? Simple. Where do you suppose I went last night? I persuaded Robertson of U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men Incorporated to arrange for a complete tour of his premises tomorrow. The three of us will go, and by the time we're through, Gloria will have it drilled into her that a robot is not alive. Mrs. Weston's eyes widened gradually, and something glinted in her eyes that was quite like sudden admiration. Why, George, that's a good idea. And George Weston's vest button strained. Only kind I have, he said. Mr. Struthers was a conscientious general manager, and naturally inclined to be a bit talkative. The combination, therefore, resulted in a tour that was fully explained, perhaps even overabundantly explained at every step. However, Mrs. Weston was not bored. Indeed, she stopped him several times and begged him to repeat his statements in simpler language so that Gloria might understand. Under the influence of this appreciation of his narrative powers, Mr. Struthers expanded genially and became ever more communicative, if possible. George Weston himself showed a gathering impatience. "Pardon me, Struthers," he said, breaking into the middle of a lecture on the photoelectric cell. "Haven't you a section of the factory where only robot labor is employed?" "Eh? Oh, yes, indeed." He smiled at Mrs. Weston. "A vicious circle, in a way, robots creating more robots. Of course, we are not making a general practice out of it. For one thing, the unions would never let us. But we can turn out a very few robots using robot labor exclusively, merely as a sort of scientific experiment. You see," he tapped his pince-nez into one palm argumentatively, "what the labor unions don't realize, and I say this as a man who has always been very sympathetic with the labor movement in general, is that the advent of the robot, while involving some dislocation to begin with, will inevitably—" "Yes, Struthers," said Weston, "but about that section of the factory you speak of, may we see it? It would be very interesting, I'm sure." Yes, of course." Mr. Struthers replaced his pince-nez in one convulsive movement and gave vent to a soft cough of discomfiture. "Follow me, please." He was comparatively quiet while leading the three through a long corridor and down a flight of stairs. Then, when they had entered a large, well-lit room that buzzed with metallic activity, the sluices opened and the flood of explanation poured forth again. "There you are," he said with pride in his voice. "Robots only. 5 men act as overseers, and they don't even stay in this room. In 5 years, that is, since we began this project, not a single accident has... Of course, the robots here assembled are comparatively simple, but..." The general manager's voice had long died to a rather soothing murmur in Gloria's ears. The whole trip seemed rather dull and pointless to her, though there were many robots in sight. None were even remotely like Robbie, though, and she surveyed them with open contempt. In this room there weren't any people at all, she noticed. Then her eyes fell upon 6 or 7 robots busily engaged at a round table halfway across the room. They widened in incredulous surprise. It was a big room. She couldn't see for sure, but one of the robots looked like... It was Robbie! Her shriek pierced the air, and one of the robots about the table faltered and dropped the tool he was holding. Gloria went almost mad with joy. Squeezing through the railing before either parent could stop her, she dropped lightly to the floor a few feet below and ran toward her Robbie, arms waving and hair flying. And the 3 horrified adults, as they stood frozen in their tracks, saw what the excited little girl did not see: a huge, lumbering tractor bearing blindly down upon its appointed track. It took split seconds for Weston to come to his senses, and those split seconds meant everything, for Gloria could not be overtaken. Although Weston vaulted the railing in a wild attempt, it was obviously hopeless. Mr. Struthers signaled wildly to the overseers to stop the tractor, but the overseers were only human, and it took time to act. It was only Robbie that acted immediately and with precision. With metal legs eating up the space between himself and his little mistress, he charged down from the opposite direction. Everything then happened at once. With one sweep of an arm, Robbie snatched up Gloria, slacking his speed not one iota, and consequently knocking every breath of air out of her. Weston, not quite comprehending all that was happening, felt rather than saw Robbie brush past him and came to a sudden bewildered halt. The tractor intersected Gloria's path half a second after Robbie had, rolled on 10 feet further, and came to a grinding, long-drawn-out stop. Gloria regained her breath, submitted to a series of passionate hugs on the part of both her parents, and turned eagerly toward Robbie. As far as she was concerned, nothing had happened except that she had found her friend. But Mrs. Weston's expression had changed from one of relief to one of dark suspicion. She turned to her husband, and despite her disheveled and undignified appearance, managed to look quite formidable. "You engineered this, didn't you?" George Weston swabbed at a hot forehead with his handkerchief. His hand was unsteady, and his lips could curve only into a tremulous and exceedingly weak smile. Mrs. Weston pursued the thought. "Robbie wasn't designed for engineering or construction work. He couldn't be of any use to them. You had him placed there deliberately so that Gloria would find him. You know you did." "Well, I did," said Weston. "But, Grace, how was I to know the reunion would be so violent? And Robbie has saved her life. You'll have to admit that. You can't send him away again." Grace Weston considered. She turned toward Gloria and Robbie and watched them abstractedly for a moment. Gloria had a grip about the robot's neck that would have asphyxiated any creature but one of metal, and was prattling nonsense in half-hysterical frenzy. Robbie's chrome steel arms, capable of bending a bar of steel 2 inches in diameter into a pretzel, wound about the little girl gently and lovingly, and his eyes glowed a deep, deep red. "Well," said Mrs. Weston at last, "I guess he can stay with us until he rusts." Susan Calvin shrugged her shoulders. "Of course he didn't. That was 1998. By 2002, we had invented the mobile speaking robot, which, of course, made all the non-speaking models out of date, and which seemed to be the final straw as far as the non-robot elements were concerned. Most of the world governments banned robot use on Earth for any purpose other than scientific research between 2003 and 2007. So that Gloria had to give up Robbie eventually? I'm afraid so. I imagine, however, that it was easier for her at the age of 15 than at 8. Still, it was a stupid and unnecessary attitude on the part of humanity. U.S. Robots hit its low point financially just about the time I joined them in 2007. At first I thought my job might come to a sudden end in a matter of months, but then we simply developed the extraterrestrial market. And then you were set, of course. Not quite. We began by trying to adapt the models we had on hand. Those first speaking models, for instance. They were about 12 feet high, very clumsy, and not much good. We sent them out to Mercury to help build the mining station there, but that failed. I looked up in surprise. It did? Why, Mercury Mines is a multi-billion-dollar concern. It is now, but it was a second attempt that succeeded. If you want to know about that, young man, I'd advise you to look up Gregory Powell. He and Michael Donovan handled our most difficult cases in the teens and 20s. I haven't heard from Donovan in years, but Powell is living right here in New York. He's a grandfather now, which is a thought difficult to get used to. I can only think of him as a rather young man. Of course, I was younger, too. I tried to keep her talking. "If you would give me the bare bones, Dr. Calvin, I can have Mr. Powell fill it in afterward." And this was exactly what I later did. She spread her thin hands out upon the desk and looked at them. "There are 2 or 3, she said, that I know a little about." "Start with Mercury," I suggested. "Well, I think it was in 2015 that the second Mercury expedition was sent out. It was exploratory and financed in part by U.S. Robots and in part by Solar Minerals. It consisted of a new type robot, still experimental. Gregory Powell, Michael Donovan. 2. Runaround. It was one of Gregory Powell's favorite platitudes that nothing was to be gained from excitement. So when Mike Donovan came leaping down the stairs toward him, red hair matted with perspiration, Powell frowned. "What's wrong?" he said. "Break a fingernail?" "Yeah," snarled Donovan feverishly. "What have you been doing in the sublevels all day?" He took a deep breath and blurted out, "Speedy never returned." Powell's eyes widened momentarily, and he stopped on the stairs. Then he recovered and resumed his upward steps. He didn't speak until he reached the head of the flight, and then, "You sent him after the selenium?" "Yes." "And how long has he been out?" 5 hours now." Silence. This was a devil of a situation. Here they were on Mercury exactly 12 hours, and already up to the eyebrows in the worst sort of trouble. Mercury had long been the jinx world of the system, but this was drawing it rather strong, even for a jinx. Powell said, "Start at the beginning and let's get this straight." They were in the radio room now, with its already subtly antiquated equipment, untouched for the 10 years previous to their arrival. Even 10 years, technologically speaking, meant so much. Compare Speedy with the type of robot they must have had back in 2005. But then advances in robotics these days were tremendous. Powell touched a still-gleaming metal surface gingerly. The air of disuse that touched everything about the room, and the entire station, was infinitely depressing. Donovan must have felt it. He began, "I tried to locate him by radio, but it was no go. Radio isn't any good on the Mercury Sun side, not past 2 miles anyway. That's one of the reasons the first expedition failed, and we can't put up the ultra-wave equipment for weeks yet." "Skip all that. What did you get?" "I located the unorganized body signal in the shortwave. It was no good for anything except his position. I kept track of him that way for 2 hours and plotted the results on the map." There was a yellowed square of parchment in his hip pocket, a relic of the unsuccessful first expedition, and he slapped it down on the desk with vicious force, spreading it flat with the palm of his hand. Powell, hands clasped across his chest, watched it at long range. Donovan's pencil pointed nervously. "The red cross is the selenium pool. You marked it yourself." "Which one is it?" interrupted Powell. "There were 3 that McDougal located for us before he left." "I sent Speedy to the nearest, naturally, 17 miles away. But what difference does that make?" There was tension in his voice. "There are the penciled dots that mark Speedy's position." And for the first time, Powell's artificial aplomb was shaken, and his hands shot forward for the map. "Are you serious? This is impossible." "There it is," growled Donovan. The little dots that marked the position formed a rough circle about the red cross of the selenium pool, and Powell's fingers went to his brown mustache, the unfailing signal of anxiety. Donovan added, "In the 2 hours I checked on him, he circled that damn pool 4 times. It seems likely to me that he'll keep that up forever. Do you realize the position we're in?" Powell looked up shortly and said nothing. Oh, yes, he realized the position they were in. It worked itself out as simply as a syllogism. The photocell banks that alone stood between the full power of Mercury's monstrous sun and themselves were shot to hell. The only thing that could save them was selenium. The only thing that could get the selenium was Speedy. If Speedy didn't come back, no selenium. No selenium, no photocell banks. No photobanks. Well, death by slow broiling is one of the more unpleasant ways of being done in. Donovan rubbed his red mop of hair savagely and expressed himself with bitterness. "You'll be the laughingstock of the system, Greg. How can everything have gone so wrong so soon? The great team of Powell and Donovan is sent out to Mercury to report on the advisability of reopening the Sunside mining station with modern techniques and robots, and we ruin everything the first day. A purely routine job, too. We'll never live it down." "We won't have to, perhaps," replied Powell quietly. "If we don't do something quickly, living anything down, or even just plain living, will be out of the question." "Don't be stupid. If you feel funny about it, Greg, I don't. It was criminal sending us out here with only 1 robot, and it was your bright idea that we could handle the photocell banks ourselves." "Now you're being unfair. It was a mutual decision, and you know it. All we needed was a kilogram of selenium, a stillhead dielectrode plate, in about 3 hours' time, and there are pools of pure selenium all over Sunside. McDougal's spectral reflector spotted 3 for us in 5 minutes, didn't it? What the devil? We couldn't have waited for next conjunction." "Well, what are we going to do? Powell, you've got an idea. I know you have, or you wouldn't be so calm. You're no more a hero than I am. Go on, spill it." "We can't go after Speedy ourselves, Mike, not on the sun side. Even the new INSO suits aren't good for more than 20 minutes in direct sunlight. But you know the old saying, set a robot to catch a robot. Look, Mike, maybe things aren't so bad. We've got 6 robots down in the sublevels that we may be able to use if they work. If they work." There was a glint of sudden hope in Donovan's eyes. "You mean 6 robots from the first expedition? Are you sure? They may be sub-robotic machines. 10 years is a long time as far as robot types are concerned, you know." "No, they're robots. I've spent all day with them, and I know. They've got positronic brains. Primitive, of course." He placed the map in his pocket. "Let's go down." The robots were on the lowest sub-level, all 6 of them surrounded by musty packing cases of uncertain content. They were large, extremely so, and even though they were in a sitting position on the floor, legs straddled out before them, their heads were a good 7 feet in the air. Donovan whistled. Look at the size of them, will you? The chests must be 10 feet around. That's because they're supplied with the old McGuffey gears. I've been over the insides. Crummiest set you've ever seen. Have you powered them yet? No, there wasn't any reason to. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. Even the diaphragm is in reasonable order. They might talk. He had unscrewed the chest plate of the nearest as he spoke, inserted the 2-inch sphere that contained the tiny spark of atomic energy that was a robot's life. There was difficulty in fitting it, but he managed, and then screwed the plate back on again in laborious fashion. The radio controls of more modern models had not been heard of 10 years earlier. And then to the other 5. Donovan said uneasily, "They haven't moved?" "No orders to do so," replied Powell succinctly. He went back to the first in the line and struck him on the chest. "You, do you hear me?" The monster's head bent slowly, and the eyes fixed themselves on Powell. Then, in a harsh, squawking voice, like that of a medieval phonograph, he grated, "Yes, master." Powell grinned humorlessly at Donovan. "Did you get that? Those were the days of the first talking robots, when it looked as if the use of robots on Earth would be banned. The makers were fighting that, and they built good, healthy slave complexes into the damned machines." "They didn't help them," muttered Donovan. "No, it didn't, but they sure tried." He turned once more to the robot. "Get up." The robot towered upward slowly, and Donovan's head craned and his puckered lips whistled. Powell said, "Can you go out upon the surface, in the light?" There was consideration while the robot's slow brain worked. Then, "Yes, master." "Good. You know what a mile is?" Another consideration, and another slow answer. "Yes, master." "We will take you up to the surface, then, and indicate a direction. You will go about 17 miles, and somewhere in that general region you will meet another robot, smaller than yourself. You understand so far?" "Yes, master." "You will find this robot and order him to return. If he does not wish to, you are to bring him back by force." Donovan clutched at Powell's sleeve. "Why not send him for the selenium direct?" "Because I want Speedy back, nitwit. I want to find out what's wrong with him." And to the robot, "All right, you, follow me." The robot remained motionless, and his voice rumbled, "Pardon, master, but I cannot. You must mount first." His clumsy arms had come together with a thwack, blunt fingers interlacing. Powell stared and then pinched at his mustache. Oh. Donovan's eyes bulged. "We've got to ride him like a horse?" "I guess that's the idea. I don't know why, though. I can't see—" "Yes, I do. I told you they were playing up robot safety in those days. Evidently they were going to sell the notion of safety by not allowing them to move about without a mahout on their shoulders all the time. What do we do now?" "That's what I've been thinking," muttered Donovan. "We can't go out on the surface, with a robot or without. Oh, for the love of Pete!" And he snapped his fingers twice. He grew excited. "Give me that map you've got. I haven't studied it for 2 hours for nothing. This is a mining station. What's wrong with using the tunnels?" The mining station was a black circle on the map, and the light dotted lines that were tunnels stretched out about it in spiderweb fashion. Donovan studied the list of symbols at the bottom of the map. "Look," he said, "the small black dots are openings to the surface, and here's one maybe 3 miles away from the selenium pool. There's a number here you'd think they'd write larger. 13A, if the robots know their way around here." Powell shot the question and received the dull, "Yes, master," in reply. "Get your inso-suit," he said with satisfaction. It was the first time either had worn the inso-suits, which marked one time more than either had expected to upon their arrival the day before, and they tested their limb movements uncomfortably. The inso-suit was far bulkier and far uglier than the regulation spacesuit, but withal considerably lighter due to the fact that they were entirely non-metallic in composition, composed of heat-resistant plastic and chemically treated cork layers, and equipped with a desiccating unit to keep the air bone dry. The inso-suits could withstand the full glare of Mercury's sun for 20 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes more as well, without actually killing the occupant. And still the robot's hands formed the stirrup, nor did he betray the slightest atom of surprise at the grotesque figure into which Powell had been converted. Powell's radio-harshened voice boomed out, "Are you ready to take us to exit 13A?" "Yes, master." Good, thought Powell. They might lack radio control, but at least they were fitted for radio reception. "Mount one or the other, Mike," he said to Donovan. He placed a foot in the improvised stirrup and swung upward. He found the seat comfortable. There was the humped back of the robot, evidently shaped for the purpose, a shallow groove along each shoulder for the thighs, and two elongated ears whose purpose now seemed obvious. Powell seized the ears and twisted the head. His mount turned ponderously. "Lead on, Macduff," but he did not feel at all light-hearted. The gigantic robots moved slowly, with mechanical precision, through the doorway that cleared their heads by a scant foot, so that the two men had to duck hurriedly, along a narrow corridor in which their unhurried footsteps boomed monotonously, and into the airlock. The long, airless tunnel that stretched to a pinpoint before them brought home forcefully to Powell the exact magnitude of the task accomplished by the first expedition with their crude robots and their start-from-scratch necessities. They might have been a failure, but their failure was a good deal better than the usual run of the system's successes. The robots plodded onward with a pace that never varied and with footsteps that never lengthened. Powell said, "Notice that these tunnels are blazing with lights and that the temperature is Earth normal. It's probably been like this all the 10 years that this place has remained empty." "How's that?" "Cheap energy, cheapest in the system. Sun power, you know. And on Mercury's sun side, sun power is something. That's why the station was built in the sunlight rather than in the shadow of a mountain. It's really a huge energy converter. The heat is turned into electricity, light, mechanical work, and what have you, so that energy is supplied and the station is cooled in a simultaneous process." "Look," said Donovan, "this is all very educational, but would you mind changing the subject? It so happens that this conversion of energy that you talk about is carried on by the photocell banks mainly, and that is a tender subject with me at the moment." Powell grunted vaguely, and when Donovan broke the resulting silence, it was to change the subject completely. "Listen, Greg, what the devil's wrong with Speedy anyway? I can't understand it." It's not easy to shrug shoulders in an inso-suit, but Powell tried it. "I don't know, Mike. You know he's perfectly adapted to a Mercurian environment. Heat doesn't mean anything to him, and he's built for the light gravity and the broken ground. He's foolproof, or at least he should be." Silence fell. This time, silence that lasted. "Master," said the robot, "we are here." "Eh?" Powell snapped out of a semi-drowse. "Well, get us out of here, out to the surface." They found themselves in a tiny substation, empty, airless, ruined. Donovan had inspected a jagged hole in the upper reaches of one of the walls by the light of his pocket flash. "Meteorite, do you suppose?" he had asked. Powell shrugged. "To hell with that, it doesn't matter. Let's get out." A towering cliff of a black basaltic rock cut off the sunlight, and the deep night shadow of an airless world surrounded them. Before them, the shadow reached out and ended in knife-edge abruptness into an all but unbearable blaze of white light that glittered from myriad crystals along the rocky ground. "Space!" gasped Donovan. "It looks like snow." And it did. Powell's eyes swept the jagged glitter of Mercury to the horizon and winced at the gorgeous brilliance. "This must be an unusual area," he said. "The general albedo of Mercury is low, and most of the soil is gray pumice, something like the moon, you know. Beautiful, isn't it?" He was thankful for the light filters in their visiplates. Beautiful or not, a look at the sunlight through straight glass would have blinded them inside of half a minute. Donovan was looking at the spring thermometer on his wrist. "Holy smokes, the temperature is 80 centigrade. Powell checked his own and said, a little high. Atmosphere, you know." "On Mercury? Are you nuts?" "Mercury isn't really airless," explained Powell in absent-minded fashion. He was adjusting the binocular attachments to his visiplate, and the bloated fingers of the inso-suit were clumsy at it. "There's a thin exhalation that clings to its surface, vapors of the more volatile elements and compounds that are heavy enough for Mercurian gravity to retain. You know, selenium, iodine, mercury, gallium, potassium, bismuth, volatile oxides. The vapors sweep into the shadows and condense, giving up heat. It's a sort of gigantic still. In fact, if you use your flash, you'll probably find that the side of the cliff is covered with, say, hoar sulfur or maybe quicksilver dew. It doesn't matter, though. Our suits can stand a measly 80 indefinitely." Powell had adjusted the binocular attachments so that he seemed as eye-stalked as a snail. Donovan watched tensely. "See anything?" The other did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was anxious and thoughtful. "There's a dark spot on the horizon that might be the selenium pool. It's in the right place. But I don't see Speedy." Powell clambered upward in an instinctive striving for better view till he was standing in unsteady fashion upon his robot's shoulders, Legs straddled wide, eyes straining, he said, I think, yes, it's definitely he. He's coming this way. Donovan followed the pointing finger. He had no binoculars, but there was a tiny, moving dot, black against the blazing brilliance of the crystalline ground. I see him, he yelled. Let's get going. Powell had hopped down into a sitting position on the robot again, and his suited hand slapped against the gargantuan's barrel chest. Get going. Giddy ap, yelled Donovan, and thumped his heels spur fashion. The robots started off, the regular thudding of their footsteps silent in the airlessness, for the non-metallic fabric of the ensosuits did not transmit sound. There was only a rhythmic vibration just below the border of actual hearing. Faster, yelled Donovan. The rhythm did not change. No use, cried Powell in reply. These junk heaps are only geared to one speed. Do you think they're equipped with selective flexors? He had burst through the shadow, and the sunlight came down in a white-hot wash and poured liquidly about them. Donovan ducked involuntarily. Wow, is it imagination, or do I feel heat? You'll feel more presently, was the grim reply. Keep your eye on Speedy. Robot SPD-13 was near enough to be seen in detail now. His graceful, streamlined body threw out blazing highlights as he loped with easy speed across the broken ground. His name was derived from his serial initials, of course, but it was apt, nevertheless, for the SPD models were among the fastest robots turned out by the United States Robot and Mechanical Men Corporation. Hey, Speedy! Howled Donovan and waved a frantic hand. Speedy! Shouted Powell. Come here! The distance between the men and the errant robot was being cut down momentarily, more by the efforts of Speedy than the slow plodding of the 50-year-old antique mounts of Donovan and Powell. They were close enough now to notice that Speedy's gait included a peculiar rolling stagger, a noticeable side-to-side lurch, and then, as Powell waved his hand again and sent maximum juice into his compact headset radio sender in preparation for another shout, Speedy looked up and saw them. Speedy hopped to a halt and remained standing for a moment with just a tiny, unsteady weave, as though he were swaying in a light wind. Powell yelled, All right, Speedy, come here, boy. Whereupon Speedy's robot voice sounded in Powell's earphones for the first time. It said, Hot dog, let's play games. You catch me and I catch you. No love can cut our knife in two, for I'm little Buttercup, sweet little Buttercup. Whoops! Turning on his heel, he sped off in the direction from which he had come, with a speed and fury that kicked up gouts of baked dust. And his last words as he receded into the distance were, There grew a little flower beneath a great oak tree, followed by a curious metallic clicking that might have been a robotic equivalent of a hiccup. Donovan said weakly, Where did he pick up the Gilbert and Sullivan? Say, Greg, he's drunk or something. If you hadn't told me, was the bitter response, I'd never realize it. Let's get back to the cliff. I'm roasting. It was Powell who broke the desperate silence. In the first place, he said, Speedy isn't drunk, not in the human sense, because he's a robot, and robots don't get drunk. However, there's something wrong with him, which is the robotic equivalent of drunkenness. To me, he's drunk, stated Donovan emphatically, and all I know is that he thinks we're playing games, and we're not. It's a matter of life and very gruesome death. All right, don't hurry me. A robot's only a robot. Once we find out what's wrong with him, we can fix it and go on. Once, said Donovan sourly. Powell ignored him. Speedy is perfectly adapted to normal Mercurian environment, but this region, and his arms swept wide, is definitely abnormal. There's our clue. Now, where do these crystals come from? They might have formed from a slowly cooling liquid, but where would you get liquid so hot that it would cool the Mercury's sun? Volcanic action, suggested Donovan instantly, and Powell's body tensed. Out of the mouths of sucklings, he said in a small, strange voice, and remained very still for 5 minutes. Then he said, Listen, Mike, what did you say to Speedy when you sent him after the selenium? Donovan was taken aback. Well, damn it, I don't know. I just told him to get it. Yes, I know, but how? Try to remember the exact words. I said, Speedy, we need some selenium. You can get it such and such a place. Go get it. That's all. What more did you want me to say? You didn't put any urgency into the order, did you? What for? It was pure routine. Powell sighed. Well, it can't be helped now, but we're in a fine fix. He had dismounted from his robot and was sitting back against the cliff. Donovan joined him, and they linked arms. In the distance, the burning sunlight seemed to wait cat and mouse for them, and just next them, the two giant robots were invisible, but for the dull red of their photoelectric eyes that stared down at them, unblinking, unwavering, and unconcerned. Unconcerned, as was all this poisonous mercury, as large in jinx as it was small in size. Powell's radio voice was tense in Donovan's ear. Now look, let's start with the 3 fundamental rules of robotics. The 3 rules that are built most deeply into a robot's positronic brain. In the darkness, his gloved fingers ticked off each point. We have, 1, a robot may not injure a human being, or through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Right. 2, continued Powell, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Right. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence, as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Right. Now, where are we? Exactly at the explanation. The conflict between the various rules is ironed out by the different positronic potentials in the brain. We'll say that a robot is walking into danger and knows it. The automatic potential that Rule 3 sets up turns him back. But suppose you order him to walk into that danger. In that case, Rule 2 sets up a counter-potential higher than the previous one, and the robot follows orders at the risk of existence. Well, I know that. What about it? Well, let's take Speedy's case. Speedy is one of the latest models, extremely specialized, and as expensive as a battleship. It's not a thing to be lightly destroyed. So Rule 3 has been strengthened. That was specifically mentioned, by the way, in the advance notices on the SPD models, so that his allergy to danger is unusually high. At the same time, when you sent him out after the selenium, you gave him his order casually and without special emphasis, so that the Rule 2 potential setup was rather weak. Now, hold on, I'm just stating facts. All right, go ahead. I think I get it. You see how it works, don't you? There's some sort of danger centering at the selenium pool. It increases as he approaches, and at a certain distance from it, the Rule 3 potential, unusually high to start with, exactly balances the Rule 2 potential, unusually low to start with. Donovan rose to his feet in excitement. And it strikes an equilibrium. I see. Rule 3 drives him back, and Rule 2 drives him forward. So he follows a circle around the selenium pool, staying on the locus of all points of potential equilibrium. And unless we do something about it, he'll stay on that circle forever, giving us the good old runaround. Then, more thoughtfully, and that, by the way, is what makes him drunk. At potential equilibrium, half the positronic paths of his brain are out of kilter. I'm not a robot specialist, but that seems obvious. Probably he's lost control of just those parts of his voluntary mechanism that a human drunk has. Very pretty. But what's the danger, if we knew what he was running from? You suggested it, volcanic action. Somewhere right above the selenium pool is a seepage of gas from the bowels of Mercury. Sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide. Lots of it. And at this temperature. Donovan gulped audibly. Carbon monoxide plus iron gives the volatile iron carbonyl. And a robot, added Powell, is essentially iron. Then, grimly, there's nothing like deduction. We've determined everything about our problem, but the solution. We can't get the selenium ourselves. It's still too far. We can't send these robot horses because they can't go themselves, and they can't carry us fast enough to keep us from crisping. And we can't catch Speedy because the dope thinks we're playing games, and he can run 60 miles to our 4. If one of us goes, began Donovan tentatively, and comes back cooked, there'll still be the other. Yes, came the sarcastic reply, it would be a most tender sacrifice, except that a person would be in no condition to give orders before he ever reaches the pool. And I don't think the robots would ever turn back to the cliff without orders. Figure it out. We're 2 or 3 miles from the pool. Call it 2. The robot travels at 4 miles an hour, and we can last 20 minutes in our suits. It isn't only the heat, remember. Solar radiation out here in the ultraviolet and below is poison. Said Donovan. 10 minutes short. As good as an eternity. And another thing, in order for Rule 3 potential to have stopped Speedy what it did, There must be an appreciable amount of carbon monoxide in the metal vapor atmosphere, and there must be an appreciable corrosive action, therefore. He's been out hours now. And how do we know when a knee joint, for instance, won't be thrown out of kilter and keel him over? It's not only a question of thinking. We've got to think fast. Deep, dark, dank, dismal silence. Donovan broke it, voice trembling in an effort to keep itself emotionless. He said, "As long as we can't increase Rule 2 potential by giving further orders, how about working the other way? If we increase the danger, we increase Rule 3 potential and drive him backward." Powell's visiplate had turned toward him in a silent question. "You see," came the cautious explanation, "all we need to do to drive him out of his rut is to increase the concentration of carbon monoxide in his vicinity. Well, back at the station there's a complete analytical laboratory." "Naturally," assented Powell. "It's a mining station." "All right, there must be pounds of oxalic acid for calcium precipitations." "Holy space! Mike, you're a genius." "So-so," admitted Donovan modestly. "It's just a case of remembering that oxalic acid on heating decomposes into carbon dioxide, water, and good old carbon monoxide. College chem, you know." Powell was on his feet and had attracted the attention of one of the monster robots by the simple expedient of pounding the machine's thigh. "Hey," he shouted, "can you throw?" "Master." "Never mind." Powell damned the robot's molasses-slow brain. He scrabbled up a jagged brick-sized rock. "Take this," he said, "and hit the patch of bluish crystals just across that crooked fissure. You see it?" Donovan pulled at his shoulder. "Too far, Greg. It's almost half a mile off." "Quiet," replied Powell. "It's a case of Mercurian gravity and a steel throwing arm. Watch, will you?" The robot's eyes were measuring the distance with machinely accurate stereoscopy. His arm adjusted itself to the weight of the missile and drew back. In the darkness, the robot's motions went unseen, but there was a sudden thumping sound as he shifted his weight, and seconds later the rock flew blackly into the sunlight. There was no air resistance to slow it down, nor wind to turn it aside, and when it hit the ground, it threw up crystals precisely in the center of the blue patch. Powell yelled happily and shouted, "Let's go back after the oxalic acid, Mike." And as they plunged into the ruined substation on the way back to the tunnels, Donovan said grimly, "Speedy's been hanging about on this side of the selenium pool ever since we chased after him. Did you see him?" "Yes." "I guess he wants to play games. Well, we'll play him games." They were back hours later with 3-liter jars of the white chemical and a pair of long faces. The photocell banks were deteriorating more rapidly than had seemed likely. The two steered their robots into the sunlight and toward the waiting Speedy in silence and with grim purpose. Speedy galloped slowly toward them. "Here we are again. Whee! I've made a little list. The piano organist. All people who eat peppermint and puff it in your face." "We'll puff something in your face," muttered Donovan. "He's limping, Greg." "I noticed that," came the low, worried response. "The monoxide will get him yet if we don't hurry." They were approaching cautiously now, almost sidling to refrain from setting off the thoroughly irrational robot. Powell was too far off to tell, of course, but even already he could have sworn the crack-brained Speedy was setting himself for a spring. "Let her go," he gasped. "Count 3. 1, 2. Two steel arms drew back and snapped forward simultaneously, and 2 glass jars whirled forward in towering parallel arcs, gleaming like diamonds in the impossible sun. And in a pair of soundless puffs, they hit the ground behind Speedy in crashes that sent the oxalic acid flying like dust. In the full heat of Mercury's sun, Powell knew it was fizzing like soda water. Speedy turned to stare, then backed away from it slowly, and as slowly gathered speed. In 15 seconds, he was leaping directly toward the 2 humans in an unsteady canter. Powell did not get Speedy's words just then, though he heard something that resembled lovers' professions when uttered in Hessians. He turned away. "Back to the cliff, Mike. He's out of the rut, and he'll be taking orders now. I'm getting hot." They jogged toward the shadow at the slow, monotonous pace of their mounts, and it was not until they had entered it and felt the sudden coolness settle softly about them that Donovan looked back. "Greg!" Powell looked and almost shrieked. Speedy was moving slowly now, so slowly, and in the wrong direction. He was drifting back into his rut, and he was picking up speed. He looked dreadfully close and dreadfully unreachable in the binoculars. Donovan shouted wildly, "After him!" and thumped his robot into its pace, but Powell called him back. "You won't catch him, Mike. It's no use." He fidgeted on his robot's shoulders and clenched his fist in tight impotence. Why the devil do I see these things 5 seconds after it's all over? Mike, we've wasted hours. We need more oxalic acid, declared Donovan stolidly. The concentration wasn't high enough. 7 tons of it wouldn't have been enough, and we haven't the hours to spare to get it, even if it were, with the monoxide chewing him away. Don't you see what it is, Mike? And Donovan said flatly, no. We were only establishing new equilibriums. When we create new monoxide and increase Rule 3 potential, he moves backward till he's in balance again, and when the monoxide drifted away, he moved forward, and again there was balance. Powell's voice sounded thoroughly wretched. It's the same old runaround. We can push at Rule 2 and pull at Rule 3, and we can't get anywhere. We can only change the position of balance. We've got to get outside both rules. And then he pushed his robot closer to Donovan so that they were sitting face to face, dim shadows in the darkness. Then he whispered, Mike, is it the finish? Dully. I suppose we go back to the station, wait for the banks to fold, shake hands, take cyanide, and go out like gentlemen. He laughed shortly. Mike, repeated Powell earnestly, we've got to get Speedy. I know. Mike, once more, and Powell hesitated before continuing. There's always Rule 1. I thought of it earlier, but it's desperate. Donovan looked up, and his voice livened. We're desperate. All right, according to Rule 1, a robot can't see a human come to harm because of his own inaction. 2 and 3 can't stand against it. They can't, Mike. Even when the robot is half crate? Well, he's drunk. You know he is. It's the chances you take. Cut it. What are you going to do? I'm going out there now and see what Rule 1 will do. If it won't break the balance, then what the devil? It's either now or 3-4 days from now. Hold on, Greg. There are human rules of behavior, too. You don't go out there just like that. Figure out a lottery and give me my chance. All right. First to get the cube of 14 goes, and almost immediately, 2744. Donovan felt his robot stagger at a sudden push by Powell's mount, and then Powell was off into the sunlight. Donovan opened his mouth to shout, and then clicked it shut. Of course the damn fool had worked out the cube of 14 in advance, and on purpose, just like him. The sun was hotter than ever, and Powell felt a maddening itch in the small of his back. Imagination, probably, or perhaps hard radiation beginning to tell even through the inso-suit. Speedy was watching him, without a word of Gilbert and Sullivan gibberish as greeting. Thank God for that, but he daren't get too close. He was 300 yards away when Speedy began backing, a step at a time, cautiously, and Powell stopped. He jumped from his robot's shoulders and landed on the crystalline ground with a light thump and a flying of jagged fragments. He proceeded on foot, the ground gritty and slippery to his steps, the low gravity causing him difficulty. The soles of his feet tickled with warmth. He cast one glance over his shoulder at the blackness of the cliff's shadow and realized that he had come too far to return, either by himself or by the help of his antique robot. It was Speedy or nothing now, and the knowledge of that constricted his chest. Far enough, he stopped. Speedy, he called. Speedy! The sleek, modern robot ahead of him hesitated and halted his backward steps, then resumed them. Powell tried to put a note of pleading into his voice and found it didn't take much acting. Speedy, I've got to get back to the shadow or the sun will get me. It's life or death, Speedy. I need you. Speedy took one step forward and stopped. He spoke, but at the sound Powell groaned, for it was, When you're lying awake with a dismal headache and repose is tabooed. It trailed off there, and Powell took time out for some reason to murmur, Iolantha. It was roasting hot. He caught a movement out of the corner of his eye and whirled dizzily, then stared in utter astonishment, for the monstrous robot on which he had ridden was moving toward him, and without a rider. He was talking. Pardon, master, I must not move without a master upon me, but you are in danger. Of course, Rule 1 potential above everything. But he didn't want that clumsy antique. He wanted Speedy. He walked away and motioned frantically. I order you to stay away. I order you to stop. It was quite useless. You could not beat Rule 1 potential. The robot said stupidly, You are in danger, master. Powell looked about him desperately. He couldn't see clearly. His brain was in a heated whirl. His breath scorched when he breathed, and the ground all about him was a shimmering haze. He called a last time desperately, Speedy! I'm dying, damn you! Where are you, Speedy? I need you! He was still stumbling backward in a blind effort to get away from the giant robot he didn't want when he felt steel fingers on his arms and a worried, apologetic voice of metallic timbre in his ears. "Holy smokes, boss, what are you doing here? And what am I doing? I'm so confused." "Never mind," murmured Powell weakly. "Get me to the shadow of the cliff, and hurry." There was one last feeling of being lifted into the air, and a sensation of rapid motion and burning heat, and he passed out. He woke with Donovan bending over him and smiling anxiously. "How are you, Greg?" "Fine," came the response. "Where's Speedy?" "Right here. I sent him out to one of the other selenium pools with orders to get that selenium at all costs this time. He got it back in 42 minutes and 3 seconds. I timed him. He still hasn't finished apologizing for the runaround he gave us. He's scared to come near you for fear of what you'll say." "Drag him over," ordered Powell. "It wasn't his fault." He held out a hand and gripped Speedy's metal paw. "It's okay, Speedy." Then to Donovan. "You know, Mike, I was just thinking—" "Yes." "Well," he rubbed his face. The air was so delightfully cool. "You know that when we get things set up here and Speedy put through his field tests, they're going to send us to the space stations next." "No!" "Yes, at least that's what old Lady Calvin told me just before we left, and I didn't say anything about it because I was going to fight the whole idea." "Fight it?" cried Donovan. "But—" "I know. It's all right with me now. 273 degrees centigrade below zero. Won't it be a pleasure?" "Space station," said Donovan. "Here I come." 3. Reason. Half a year later, the boys had changed their minds. The flame of a giant sun had given way to the soft blackness of space, but external variations mean little in the business of checking the workings of experimental robots. Whatever the background, one is face-to-face with an inscrutable positronic brain, which the slide rule geniuses say should work thus and so, except that they don't. Powell and Donovan found that out after they had been on the station less than 2 weeks. Gregory Powell spaced his words for emphasis. "1 week ago, Donovan and I put you together." His brows furrowed doubtfully, and he pulled the end of his brown mustache. It was quiet in the officers' room of Solar Station Number 5, except for the soft purring of the mighty beam director somewhere far below. Robot QT-1 sat immovable. The burnished plates of his body gleamed in the Luxites, and the glowing red of the photoelectric cells that were his eyes were fixed steadily upon the Earthman at the other side of the table. Powell repressed a sudden attack of nerves. These robots possessed peculiar brains. Oh, the 3 laws of robotics held. They had to. All of U.S. robots, from Robertson himself to the new floor sweeper, would insist on that. So QT-1 was safe. And yet, the QT models were the first of their kind. And this was the first of the QTs. Mathematical squiggles on paper were not always the most comforting protection against robotic fact. Finally, the robot spoke. His voice carried the cold timbre inseparable from a metallic diaphragm. "Do you realize the seriousness of such a statement, Powell?" "Something made you, Cutie," pointed out Powell. "You admit yourself that your memory seems to spring full-grown from an absolute blankness of a week ago. I'm giving you the explanation. Donovan and I put you together from the parts shipped us." Cutie gazed upon his long, supple fingers in an oddly human attitude of mystification. "It strikes me that there should be a more satisfactory explanation than that. For you to make me seems improbable." The Earthman laughed quite suddenly. "Interests name, why?" "Call it intuition. That's all it is so far. But I intend to reason it out, though. A chain of valid reasoning can end only with the determination of truth, and I'll stick till I get there." Powell stood up and seated himself at the table's edge, next to the robot. He felt a sudden strong sympathy for this strange machine. It was not at all like the ordinary robot, attending to his specialized task at the station with the intensity of a deeply ingrooved positronic path. He placed a hand upon Cutie's steel shoulder, and the metal was cold and hard to the touch. "Cutie," he said, "I'm going to try to explain something to you. You're the first robot who's ever exhibited curiosity as to his own existence, and I think the first that's really intelligent enough to understand the world outside. Here, come with me." The robot rose erect smoothly. and his thickly sponge-rubber-soled feet made no noise as he followed Powell. The Earthman touched a button, and a square section of the wall flickered aside. The thick, clear glass revealed space, star-speckled. "I've seen that in the observation ports in the engine room," said Cutie. "I know," said Powell. "What do you think it is?" "Exactly what it seems. A black material just beyond this glass that is spotted with little gleaming dots. I know that our director sends out beams to some of these dots, always to the same ones, and also that these dots shift, and that the beams shift with them. That is all." "Good. Now, I want you to listen carefully. The blackness is emptiness, vast emptiness, stretching out infinitely. The little gleaming dots are huge masses of energy-filled matter. They are globes, some of them millions of miles in diameter, and for comparison, this station is only 1 mile across. They seem so tiny because they are incredibly far off. The dots to which our energy beams are directed are nearer and much smaller. They are cold and hard, and human beings like myself live upon their surfaces, many billions of them. It is from one of these worlds that Donovan and I come. Our beams feed these worlds energy, drawn from one of those huge incandescent globes that happens to be near us. We call that globe the sun, and it is on the other side of the station, where you can't see it." Cutie remained motionless before the port, like a steel statue. His head did not turn as he spoke. "Which particular dot of light do you claim to come from?" Powell searched. "There it is, the very bright one in the corner. We call it Earth." He grinned. "Good old Earth. There are 3 billions of us there, Cutie, and in about 2 weeks I'll be back there with them." And then, surprisingly enough, Cutie hummed abstractedly. There was no tune to it, but it possessed a curious twanging quality, as of plucked strings. It ceased as suddenly as it had begun. "But where do I come in, Powell? You haven't explained my existence." "The rest is simple. When these stations were first established to feed solar energy to the planets, they were run by humans. However, the heat, the hard solar radiations, and the electron storms made the post a difficult one. Robots were developed to replace human labor, and now only 2 human executives are required for each station. We are trying to replace even those, and that's where you come in. You're the highest type of robot ever developed, and if you show the ability to run this station independently, no human need ever come here again, except to bring parts for repairs." His hand went up, and the metal visi-lid snapped back into place. Powell returned to the table and polished an apple upon his sleeve before biting into it. The red glow of the robot's eyes held him. "Do you expect me," said Cutie slowly, "to believe any such complicated, implausible hypothesis as you have just outlined? What do you take me for?" Powell sputtered apple fragments onto the table and turned red. "Why, damn you, it wasn't a hypothesis. Those were facts." Cutie sounded grim. "Globes of energy, millions of miles across, worlds with 3 billion humans on them, infinite emptiness. Sorry, Powell, but I don't believe it. I'll puzzle this thing out for myself. Goodbye." He turned and stalked out of the room. He brushed past Michael Donovan on the threshold with a grave nod and passed down the corridor, oblivious to the astounded stare that followed him. Mike Donovan rumpled his red hair and shot an annoyed glance at Powell. "What was that walking junkyard talking about? What doesn't he believe?" The other dragged at his mustache bitterly. "He's a skeptic," was the bitter response. "He doesn't believe we made him, or that Earth exists, or space, or stars." "Sizzling Saturn, we've got a lunatic robot on our hands." "He says he's going to figure it all out for himself." "Well, now," said Donovan sweetly, "I do hope he'll condescend to explain it all to me after he's puzzled everything out." Then, with sudden rage, "Listen, if that metal mess gives me any lip like that, I'll knock that chromium cranium right off its torso." He seated himself with a jerk and drew a paperbacked mystery novel out of his inner jacket pocket. "That robot gives me the willies anyway. Too damned inquisitive." Mike Donovan growled from behind the huge lettuce and tomato sandwich as Cutie knocked gently and entered. "Is Powell here?" Donovan's voice was muffled with pauses for mastication. "He's gathering data on electronic stream functions. We're heading for storm, looks like." Gregory Powell entered as he spoke, eyes on the graphed paper in his hands, and dropped into a chair. He spread the sheets out before him and began scribbling calculations. Donovan stared over his shoulder, crunching lettuce and dribbling breadcrumbs. Cutie waited silently. Powell looked up. "The zeta potential is rising, but slowly. Just the same, the stream functions are erratic, and I don't know what to expect. Oh, hello, Cutie. I thought you were supervising the installation of the new drive bar." "It's done," said the robot quietly. "And so I've come to have a talk with the two of you." "Oh." Powell looked uncomfortable. "Well, sit down." "No, not that chair. One of the legs is weak, and you're no lightweight." The robot did so, and said placidly, "I have come to a decision." Donovan glowered and put the remnants of his sandwich aside. "If it's on any of that screwy—" The other motioned impatiently for silence. "Go ahead, Cutie. We're listening." "I have spent these last 2 days in concentrated introspection," said Cutie, "and the results have been most interesting. I began at the one sure assumption I felt permitted to make. I, myself, exist because I think." Powell groaned. "Oh, Jupiter, a robot Descartes." "Who's Descartes?" demanded Donovan. "Listen, do we have to sit here and listen to this metal maniac?" "Keep quiet, Mike." Cutie continued imperturbably. "And the question that immediately arose was, just what is the cause of my existence?" Powell's jaw set lumpily. "You're being foolish. I told you already that we made you." "And if you don't believe us," added Donovan, "we'll gladly take you apart." The robot spread his strong hands in a deprecatory gesture. "I accept nothing on authority. A hypothesis must be backed by reason, or else it is worthless, and it goes against all the dictates of logic to suppose that you made me." Powell dropped a restraining arm upon Donovan's suddenly bunched fist. "Just why do you say that?" Cutie laughed. It was a very inhuman laugh, the most machine-like utterance he had yet given vent to. It was sharp and explosive, as regular as a metronome, and as uninflected. "Look at you," he said finally. "I say this in no spirit of contempt, but look at you. The material you are made of is soft and flabby, lacking endurance and strength, depending for energy upon the inefficient oxidation of organic material, like that." He pointed a disapproving finger at what remained of Donovan's sandwich. "Periodically you pass into a coma, and the least variation in temperature, air pressure, humidity, or radiation intensity impairs your efficiency. You are makeshift. I, on the other hand, am a finished product. I absorb electrical energy directly and utilize it with an almost 100% efficiency. I am composed of strong metal, am continuously conscious, and can stand extremes of environment easily. These are facts which, with the self-evident proposition that no being can create another being superior to itself, smashes your silly hypothesis to nothing." Donovan's muttered curses rose into intelligibility as he sprang to his feet, rusty eyebrows drawn low. "All right, you son of a hunk of iron ore. If we didn't make you, who did?" Cutie nodded gravely. "Very good, Donovan. That was indeed the next question. Evidently my creator must be more powerful than myself, and so there was only one possibility." The Earthmen looked blank, and Cutie continued. "What is the center of activities here in the station? What do we all serve? What absorbs all our attention?" He waited expectantly. Donovan turned a startled look upon his companion. "I'll bet this tin-plated screwball is talking about the energy converter itself." "Is that right, Cutie?" grinned Powell. "I am talking about the master," came the cold, sharp answer. It was the signal for a roar of laughter from Donovan, and Powell himself dissolved into a half-suppressed giggle. Cutie had risen to his feet, and his gleaming eyes passed from one Earthman to the other. "It is so just the same, and I don't wonder that you refuse to believe. You, too, are not long to stay here, I'm sure. Powell himself said that at first only men served the master, that there followed robots for the routine work, and finally myself for the executive labor. The facts are no doubt true, but the explanation entirely illogical. Do you want the truth behind it all? Go ahead, cutie. You're amusing. The Master created humans first as the lowest type, most easily formed. Gradually, he replaced them by robots, the next higher step. And finally, he created me to take the place of the last humans. From now on, I serve the Master. You'll do nothing of the sort, said Powell sharply. You'll follow our orders and keep quiet until we're satisfied that you can run the converter. Get that? The converter, not the Master. If you don't satisfy us, you will be dismantled. And now, if you don't mind, you can leave and take this data with you and file it properly. Cutie accepted the graphs handed him and left without another word. Donovan leaned back heavily in his chair and shoved thick fingers through his hair. There's going to be trouble with that robot. He's pure nuts. The drowsy hum of the converter is louder in the control room, and mixed with it is the chuckle of the Geiger counters and the erratic buzzing of half a dozen little signal lights. Donovan withdrew his eye from the telescope and flashed the lux lights on. The beam from station number 4 caught Mars on schedule. We can break ours now. Powell nodded abstractedly. Cutie's down in the engine room. I'll flash the signal and he can take care of it. Look, Mike, what do you think of these figures? The other cocked an eye at them and whistled. Boy, that's what I call gamma-ray intensity. Old Sol is feeling his oats all right. Yeah, was the sour response. And we're in a bad position for an electron storm, too. Our Earth beam is right in the probable path. He shoved his chair away.